The German shepherd limped through the fading light, his once proud gait now a desperate stagger. Blood matted his fur, not his own, but Sarah's. Each labored breath sent pain through his scarred ribs as he reached the trail junction where hikers gathered. Max barked hoarsely, lunging toward a young couple who recoiled in fear. "Keep that stray away!" the man shouted, pulling his partner back. Twice more, Max tried approaching others, only to be met with raised hiking poles and threats. Exhaustion and desperation overwhelmed him as the sun dipped lower. His human was dying. Time was running out. When the bearded man with hollow eyes appeared at the viewpoint, something in Max recognized a kindred brokenness. The dog approached slowly, then did what Sarah had taught him during their darkest nights together. He rose onto his hind legs, placed his bloodied paws together, and whimpered a prayer for help. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Sarah Anderson's weathered hands trembled slightly as she placed fresh flowers beside the dual photograph frame. Her husband James and son Michael, both gone 5 years ago in a single icy curve of fate on Route 26. Her modest ranch house sat at the edge of Silver Pine National Forest, its worn exterior mirroring the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief. At 65, Sarah had outlived the future she'd planned. Her retirement from veterinary research now filled with volunteer work at the local animal shelter, and long, solitary walks that neighbors mistook for healthy coping, but were really conversations with ghosts. 3 years ago, on such a walk, Sarah had discovered Max. The German shepherd had been chained to a tree behind an abandoned property, scarred from cigarette burns and systematic abuse. The military tattoo in his ear revealed his past as a training washout, deemed too sensitive for combat work. Where others saw a dangerous, damaged animal, Sarah recognized a kindred broken spirit. The shelter had warned her. A dog with his trauma might never fully recover. But Sarah understood trauma intimately. Sometimes surviving was its own kind of victory. Ethan Miller's reflection in his truck window showed a man barely recognizable from his military ID. Beard unkempt, eyes shadowed by nightmares that followed him home from Afghanistan. 8 years as a combat medic had left him with medals he kept in a coffee tin, and memories he couldn't outrun. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months ago, his wife's parting words still echoing. "You came back a stranger." Now home was his pickup truck, his possessions reduced to camping gear and camera equipment. Photography had become both livelihood and therapy, capturing beauty in a world that had shown him primarily its cruelty. His only connection to his former self was the worn dog tags and the empty space where Ajax, his military service dog, should have been, killed protecting Ethan's unit on their final patrol. Unbeknownst to either Sarah or Ethan, Daniel Warner monitored Silver Pine Trail 3 mornings each week, tracking Sarah's predictable routine. His meticulous journal documented her habits, how she always hiked with Max, always followed the eastern ridge, always paused at Lookout Point. His research on her had been thorough, from her former position at Meridian Pharmaceuticals to her current volunteer work. The obituary for his son Aidan was carefully pressed between the journal's pages, alongside the consent forms bearing Sarah's signature as research supervisor. 5 years of grief had crystallized into a single, clarifying purpose: justice. The morning dawned with a golden haze that Sarah always thought made the forest look enchanted. She zipped her light jacket against the spring chill, smiling as Max circled excitedly by the door. These morning hikes had become their ritual, her reminder that life continued, his daily celebration of freedom. "Ready for our adventure, boy?" she asked, clipping on his leash. Max responded with his characteristic head tilt, those intelligent amber eyes seeming to understand far more than ordinary dogs. The veterinarian in Sarah recognized his exceptional cognition. The lonely woman in her treated him like family. The Silver Pine Trail was quiet at this hour. Sarah preferred it this way, just bird song and the crunch of pine needles underfoot. Max trotted ahead, occasionally glancing back as if checking she was still following. His transformation over 3 years had been remarkable. Those scars still marked his coat. The fearful, aggressive animal had become a gentle, watchful companion. They had reached the steepest part of the trail when Sarah paused to catch her breath. At 65, these inclines reminded her she wasn't getting any younger. "Just need a minute, Max," she said, taking a drink from her water bottle. Max circled back, but something in his posture changed. Ears forward, body tense. Sarah didn't see Daniel until he stepped from behind the large boulder. He wore hiking clothes and a friendly smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Beautiful morning," he said conversationally. "You hike here often?" Something about his tone raised Sarah's instincts. Max moved between them, a low growl forming in his throat. "Occasionally," Sarah answered vaguely. "My dog doesn't really like strangers, so I should keep moving." "Your dog?" Daniel repeated, his smile fading. "Interesting choice for someone like you to have a companion who's so loyal." Sarah's confusion lasted only seconds before recognition dawned. "I know you," she whispered. "I've waited a long time to hear you say that," Daniel replied, reaching into his pocket. "Aidan Warner. Does that name mean anything to you, Dr. Anderson?" Sarah stepped back. "You're Daniel Warner. I sent you letters. You never responded." "Letters don't bring back dead sons," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Aidan suffered for weeks. Did you watch the trial participants suffer, Dr. Anderson, or just sign the reports?" Max's growling intensified. Sarah reached for his collar. "Daniel, I understand your anger, but—" "No, you don't understand," Daniel interrupted, producing a hunting knife. "But you will." What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Max lunged as Daniel charged. Sarah stumbled backward on the rocky path, losing her footing. Her scream echoed through the forest as she fell down the steep embankment. Pain exploded in her leg and side upon impact. Above, she heard Max's frantic barking and Daniel's shouts. Sarah tried to move, but felt the sickening grind of broken bone. Warm blood soaked through her hiking pants. Max appeared on the slope, scrambling down to her side, whining anxiously as he nuzzled her face. "Good boy," she whispered through gritted teeth. Shock was setting in, making her thoughts fuzzy. She could see Daniel peering over the edge, his expression a mix of shock and resolve. "I didn't mean for you to fall," he called down, but made no move to help. Sarah's medical training told her what her fading consciousness didn't want to accept. The femoral artery might be compromised. Without help, she had hours at most. She heard Daniel retreating up the trail. "Max," she said, focusing on the dog's concerned face, "go get help. Go." Her command faded as she struggled to stay conscious. Max whined, torn between staying and obeying. Sarah used the last of her strength to point up the trail. Go, Max. Help! With one last anxious look, Max bounded up the slope. Sarah watched him disappear, knowing their bond might have just saved her life, or sealed her fate. The forest grew quiet as she drifted into unconsciousness, the morning sun filtering through the trees onto her still form. Meanwhile, 7 miles away, Ethan Miller focused his camera on a pair of eagles nesting on a cliff face. For once, his nightmares had receded enough to allow him a full night's sleep in his truck. Photography days were his best days, when the lens created distance between himself and the world, when beauty temporarily overshadowed memory. He couldn't have known that fate was already rushing toward him in the form of a desperate, bloodied German shepherd who would force him to engage with life again. Ethan Miller lowered his camera, staring at the desperate animal before him. The German shepherd's unusual posture, standing on hind legs with front paws pressed together, triggered something in his memory. Ajax had been trained to signal danger this way during their deployment. This couldn't be coincidence. "Easy, boy," he said softly, setting his camera down. The dog's amber eyes held an almost human desperation. Blood matted its fur in patches, too much blood for a minor injury. Ethan noticed the military tattoo in the dog's ear and felt a jolt of recognition. Another veteran, of sorts. When Ethan took a tentative step forward, the dog dropped to all fours and darted several yards down the trail, then turned back, barking urgently. The classic "follow me" behavior he'd seen search and rescue dogs perform during training exercises. "Someone's hurt?" Ethan asked, his combat medic instincts stirring beneath years of suppressed trauma. The dog barked again, more insistent. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. Following a strange dog into the forest went against every self-protective instinct he'd cultivated since returning from Afghanistan. His therapist would call this a high-risk, impulsive decision. But the dog's behavior was too purposeful, too trained to ignore. "All right," he sighed, grabbing his first aid kit from his truck. "Show me." The dog led him at a punishing pace, occasionally circling back to ensure Ethan followed. They veered off the main trail onto more difficult terrain, moving deeper into the forest than Ethan had ventured before. His military training kicked in as he mentally marked their route, noting landmarks for the return journey. After 30 minutes of increasingly difficult hiking, Ethan heard a faint call for help. The dog's pace quickened, and Ethan broke into a run, following the animal around a sharp bend in the trail and down a steep embankment. There, partially hidden by underbrush, lay an older woman in hiking clothes, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Blood had soaked through her pants, and her face was pale from shock and blood loss. The dog rushed to her side, whining softly as it nuzzled her face. Ethan's medical training took over instantly. "Ma'am, I'm Ethan Miller. I have emergency medical training. Can you tell me your name?" He knelt beside her, already assessing her injuries with practiced efficiency. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sarah Anderson. Max found you." Her hand weakly gestured toward the dog. "He did," Ethan confirmed, opening his first aid kit. The femur was clearly fractured, possibly compound, and the blood loss concerned him greatly. "I need to stop this bleeding and stabilize your leg. It's going to hurt." As Ethan worked, applying pressure to the wound and constructing a makeshift splint from branches and his belt, he explained each step to keep her conscious. "My unit called me Doc in Afghanistan. Haven't used these skills in a while, but some things you don't forget." Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as Ethan worked. He knew she needed evacuation and proper medical care soon. His satellite phone had no signal in the ravine, which meant he'd need to either move her or climb to higher ground. "We need to get you out of here," he said, finishing the bandaging. "Can you tell me what happened? Did you fall?" Before Sarah could answer, Max's demeanor changed dramatically. The dog's ears flattened, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan tensed, scanning their surroundings. "Hello?" called a male voice from above. "Park Ranger! Is someone injured down there?" Relief flooded through Ethan. "Yes! We need medical evacuation. Elderly female with severe leg trauma and blood loss." A man in what appeared to be a ranger uniform appeared at the top of the embankment. "I'm Ranger Warner. I can radio for emergency services." He started making his way down carefully. Ethan turned back to Sarah, expecting to see relief on her face. Instead, her eyes had widened in terror. Her hand clutched weakly at his sleeve. "No," she whispered. "He's not Ranger." Max's growl intensified, his body positioning protectively between Sarah and the approaching man. The hair on the dog's back stood rigid, and his scarred muzzle pulled back to reveal teeth. Ethan's combat-honed instincts flared. Something was very wrong. He subtly shifted his position, one hand moving to the hunting knife on his belt, while the other remained on Sarah's pulse. "Quite a fall you had, Dr. Anderson," the supposed ranger said as he reached them, his tone oddly familiar. "Fortunate this gentleman found you." Ethan noted the lack of proper ranger equipment, the too-new uniform with no wear patterns, the absence of a radio or official identification. Most tellingly, he spotted dried blood on the man's knuckles. "You two know each other?" Ethan asked carefully, maintaining a neutral expression while positioning himself more strategically. "Oh, Dr. Anderson and I go way back," the man said, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Don't we, Doctor? Back to Meridian Pharmaceuticals and the wonder drug that killed my son." The pieces clicked into place for Ethan. This wasn't a chance encounter. The man had followed Sarah, perhaps attacked her. The ranger uniform was a disguise to gain trust. "I've already called for help," Ethan lied smoothly. The protective instinct that had kept his unit alive in hostile territory now fully awakened. "Emergency services are on their way." Warner's expression flickered briefly. "That's impossible. There's no cell service in this ravine." "Satellite phone," Ethan countered, doubling down on the bluff. "Standard equipment for wildlife photographers in remote areas." The standoff intensified, with Max's growling providing a constant backdrop of warning. Sarah's breathing had grown more labored, her need for medical attention increasingly urgent. Warner's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. "Well, I should check on their ETA then. My radio works on these ridges." Ethan tensed, uncertain whether Warner was reaching for a communication device or a weapon. Before either man could act, Max suddenly lunged forward, not attacking but positioning himself directly between Warner and Sarah, his intention unmistakable. No one would harm his human. The momentary distraction gave Ethan the opportunity he needed. "Look," he said firmly, "whatever dispute you have with Dr. Anderson can wait. She needs immediate medical attention or she'll die. Are you prepared to let that happen?" For a moment, genuine conflict crossed Warner's face, a glimpse of the man beneath the vengeance. In that hesitation, Ethan recognized something he'd seen in the mirror. Pain that had hardened into purpose, however misguided. "Her company took my son," Warner said quietly. 16 years old. The trial was supposed to help his asthma. Instead, it destroyed his lungs. "And will this bring him back?" Ethan asked, his voice level despite the tension coiling through him. Years of talking down agitated civilians in combat zones had taught him the power of calm reason in volatile situations. Warner's eyes darted between Sarah's unconscious form, Max's protective stance, and Ethan's steady gaze. A complex calculation seemed to unfold behind his expression. "I just wanted her to admit what they did," he finally said. "I didn't push her. She fell running from me." "Right now, that doesn't matter," Ethan replied. "What matters is whether another person dies today. Help me get her out of here, and you can walk away. I won't stop you." The offer hung in the air between them, a tacit acknowledgement that Ethan understood the difference between justice and vengeance. He had seen too much death already. After what seemed like an eternity, Warner nodded once. "There's a ranger station 2 miles north with a medical kit and radio. I'll show you the fastest route." The fragile truce established, they prepared to move Sarah. As Ethan fashioned a stretcher from his jacket and broken branches, he kept Warner in his peripheral vision, unwilling to fully trust the man's apparent change of heart. Max remained vigilant, his eyes never leaving Warner, ready to protect Sarah at any cost. What had begun as a solitary photography expedition had transformed into something far more complex, a life-or-death race against time, with a traumatized dog as guide, an injured stranger as patient, and a grieving father as either ally or threat. Ethan couldn't help but feel that fate had orchestrated this convergence of broken souls, each carrying their own wounds into this forest crucible. Moving Sarah proved more challenging than anticipated. The makeshift stretcher sagged dangerously with each step, forcing frequent stops to readjust. Ethan took the heavier end, his muscles straining against the weight. Warner walked ahead, supposedly guiding them toward the ranger station, but frequently glancing back with an unreadable expression. Max never left Sarah's side, his body occasionally brushing against the stretcher as if reassuring her of his presence. "How much further?" Ethan asked, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool spring air. Sarah's condition was deteriorating, her breathing shallow, skin clammy with shock. "Half-mile around this ridge," Warner replied, pointing to a steep incline. "There's an access road on the other side where emergency vehicles can reach us." Ethan studied Warner's face, searching for deception. The man's grief seemed genuine, but grief could curdle into something dangerous. He'd seen it happen to fellow soldiers, the transformation of pain into destructive purpose. "Your dog is remarkably well trained," Warner observed, as Max maneuvered carefully beside the stretcher. "Military?" "He's not mine," Ethan replied. "He's hers. And yes, the tattoo in his ear suggests military training." Warner nodded thoughtfully. "Aiden always wanted a dog. My wife was allergic." The casual mention of his deceased son seemed to surprise even Warner himself, his features briefly softening before hardening again. As they rounded the ridge, rain began to fall, light at first, then increasingly heavy. The forest path turned slick and treacherous. Sarah stirred on the stretcher, mumbling incoherently. Max whined anxiously, pressing closer to her side. "We need to hurry," Ethan urged, feeling the stretcher fabric grow damp beneath his hands. The rain complicated everything, increasing the risk of hypothermia on top of Sarah's other injuries. Warner pointed to a cluster of trees ahead. "The station's just beyond that clearing. We can—" He was interrupted by Sarah's sudden clarity. "Max," she called weakly. "Come here, boy." The dog immediately moved to position his head near hers. She whispered something into his ear, a gesture so intimate that both men instinctively looked away. "You really care about her," Warner said to Max, as if the dog could understand. Something in his tone had changed, a note of confusion, perhaps even shame. "Why did you do it?" Ethan asked quietly. "Attack an elderly woman in the forest?" Warner's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand. My son suffered for months. The company covered it up, claimed his death was an anomaly. She was the lead researcher. She signed off on the reports." Sarah's voice rose again, stronger this time. "I tried to stop the trial. Check the record," she gasped with pain as they navigated a particularly rough section of trail. "I filed safety concerns. They buried them." Warner's steps faltered. "You're lying. You're just trying to save yourself." "Look in my home office. Blue file, all documented." Sarah's voice faded as consciousness slipped away again. The revelation hung in the air between them, complicated by the rain and Sarah's worsening condition. Ethan noted the conflict in Warner's eyes, the desperate need to cling to certainty, battling against the possibility he'd directed his rage at the wrong person. They reached the clearing, but the promised ranger station wasn't there. Just more forest and a small, dilapidated hunting cabin. "Where's the station?" Ethan demanded, his suspicion flaring. "This is it," Warner admitted. "It's not a real station, but it's shelter, and I have supplies inside." Ethan tightened his grip on the stretcher. "More lies?" "The supplies are real," Warner insisted. "Medical kit, blankets, radio. I prepared everything for after." The implication chilled Ethan more than the rain. Warner had planned this confrontation thoroughly, including its aftermath. Inside the cabin, Warner lit a kerosene lamp, revealing a space both Spartan and meticulously organized. True to his word, a comprehensive first aid kit sat on a small table alongside a weather radio. A military-grade sleeping bag was rolled neatly in one corner. The preparation was unsettling. They transferred Sarah to the sleeping bag. Her face was ghostly pale, her breathing increasingly labored. Ethan quickly checked her vital signs while Max positioned himself protectively at her head. "Her pulse is weak and thready," he reported, opening the medical kit. "She needs a hospital, not field medicine." Warner held up the weather radio. "No service in this storm. We're on our own until it passes." Ethan didn't miss the shift from you to we, a subtle acknowledgement that Warner was now invested in Sarah's survival, at least temporarily. As Ethan worked to clean and redress Sarah's wound, he noticed Max watching Warner with unwavering attention. The dog's posture remained alert, but less openly aggressive, as if reassessing the threat level. "Tell me about Aiden," Ethan said, hoping conversation might reveal more about Warner's intentions. "What was he like?" The question seemed to catch Warner off guard. "He was brilliant. Wanted to be a marine biologist. Good kid. Never complained, even when the asthma was bad." His voice cracked slightly. "He volunteered for the trial. Thought it might help other kids like him. That's the worst part. He died trying to help others." Something in the story triggered a memory for Ethan. Meridian's teen asthma trial? I remember the news coverage. There were allegations of falsified data. Warner's eyes widened in surprise. You know about it? My ex-wife was a pharmaceutical compliance officer. Different company, but the case was infamous in the industry. This coincidence seemed to throw Warner off balance. He sat heavily on a wooden chair, staring at Sarah's unconscious form. 5 years, he said quietly. 5 years of believing she was one of the executives who covered it up. Her signature was on Aiden's consent forms. Signatures on forms don't tell the whole story, Ethan replied, thinking of the countless battlefield reports he'd signed that could never capture the reality of what had happened. The cabin fell silent, except for the rain drumming on the roof and Sarah's labored breathing. Max suddenly raised his head, ears perked forward. A moment later, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. "Water," she whispered. Ethan helped her drink while Warner watched from his corner, conflict evident in his expression. When she finished, Sarah's gaze found Warner. "Daniel," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite her condition. "I remember you now." "You never came to the family meetings after." "They were just for show," Warner replied bitterly. "Corporate theater, to manage liability." Sarah shook her head weakly. "I organized those meetings against company policy." "I was trying to help the families get answers." Before Warner could respond, Sarah continued. "I resigned 2 months after Aiden died. Filed reports with the FDA about data manipulation. They launched an investigation, but it was too late for the trial participants." Her breath caught with pain. "I've lived with that failure every day since." Warner's carefully constructed narrative was visibly crumbling. 5 years of focused rage suddenly lacked a clear target. "If what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "why didn't you reach out to the families personally?" "I did," Sarah replied. "I wrote letters, attended Aiden's funeral, though I stayed at the back." "You were surrounded by so many people," her voice trailed off. Recognition dawned on Warner's face. "The woman with the white roses. That was you?" Sarah nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. "White roses were what my son Michael wanted at his funeral. He died the same year as Aiden. Car accident." The parallels between their losses created a strange, uncomfortable bond in the small cabin. Ethan watched as years of Warner's certainty visibly eroded, leaving the raw grief beneath. Max, sensing the shift in emotional temperature, moved cautiously toward Warner. The dog stopped a few feet away, his intelligent eyes fixed on Warner's face. It was neither threatening nor friendly, merely watchful, as if making an assessment. "I don't understand," Warner whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "If you're not responsible, who do I blame now?" "The same people I've blamed for 5 years," Sarah answered. "The executives who ignored the warning signs." "The system that prioritizes profit over safety." Her voice grew fainter. "But Daniel, believe me when I tell you, it doesn't help. The blame doesn't bring them back." Warner buried his face in his hands, his shoulders beginning to shake. 5 years of purpose, however destructive, was dissolving before him. Ethan recognized the dangerous moment for what it was. In his military experience, the collapse of a driving narrative could trigger unpredictable reactions. Some men found relief in the release of misplaced anger. Others became more dangerous when their justifications evaporated. Max seemed to sense the precariousness of the situation, too. The dog did something extraordinary. He approached Warner and gently placed his head on the man's knee. The simple gesture of comfort from an animal who had every reason to fear humans broke something in Warner. His composed veneer cracked completely, tears streaming down his face. "I just wanted someone to be held accountable," he sobbed. "I wanted it to matter that my son died." "It did matter," Sarah whispered. "It does matter." Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows like nature itself was responding to the emotional tempest within the cabin. The weather radio crackled with static, the only reminder of a world beyond their isolated conflagration of grief, guilt, and unexpected connection. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, Ethan found himself in the strange position of medic to both physical and emotional wounds. As a combat veteran, he recognized the symptoms of traumatic fixation in Warner, the desperate need to make sense of senseless loss by assigning blame and pursuing retribution. He had walked a similar path after losing members of his unit, after losing Ajax. "Daniel," Ethan said quietly, using Warner's first name deliberately. "I need your help to keep her stable until this storm passes. Can I count on you?" The question offered Warner a lifeline, an immediate purpose to replace the one that had just collapsed. After a long moment, Warner nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Tell me what to do," he said. As the three broken souls and one loyal dog waited out the storm in the tiny cabin, something unexpected began to form, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their respective traumas. Sarah drifted between consciousness and darkness, each time returning with a little less strength but the same gentle dignity. Max remained vigilant, moving between Sarah and the two men as if monitoring all three. Warner assisted Ethan with medical care, his hands steady despite his emotional turmoil. In the corner of the cabin, Warner's backpack sat unopened. Inside was a digital recorder he'd planned to use to document Sarah's confession, a symbolic justice he'd imagined would finally allow him to move forward. Now, as he helped change Sarah's bandages, the recorder's existence seemed like evidence of a stranger's obsession, a man he no longer fully recognized as himself. Sarah's condition stabilized somewhat, but Ethan knew it was temporary. The cabin's first aid supplies allowed him to treat the symptoms, not the underlying trauma. She needed surgery, blood transfusions, and professional care. "The storm's passing," Warner observed, peering through the cabin's small window at the lightening sky. "We should be able to call for help soon." Ethan nodded, checking Sarah's pulse again. Her skin was cool and pale, her breathing shallow but steady. Max lay beside her, his body providing warmth against the cabin's chill. "When help arrives," Ethan said carefully, "what will you tell them happened today?" The question hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that Warner's actions, regardless of his motivations, had legal consequences. Warner stared at his hands, the same hands that had held a weapon against Sarah hours earlier. "The truth," he finally answered, "that I followed her into the forest to confront her about my son's death. That she fell trying to get away from me." He paused, swallowing hard. "That I almost let my grief turn me into someone Aiden would have been ashamed of." The admission cost him visibly, each word emerging as if physically painful. Ethan recognized the particular courage it took to face one's darkest self, a courage many of his fellow veterans had lacked upon returning home. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening to focus on Warner. Not too late, she whispered. Never too late to choose differently. Her words, simple yet profound, seemed to reach something essential in Warner. He knelt beside her, tears returning to his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, the inadequacy of the words evident in his expression. "I was so certain you were one of them." "Grief blinds us sometimes," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "Makes us see enemies where there are none." Ethan turned away, giving them privacy for this fragile reconciliation. Through the window, he watched the clouds breaking apart, sunlight beginning to pierce through in golden shafts that illuminated the rain-soaked forest. The sight reminded him of battlefield mornings after night operations, the strange juxtaposition of nature's beauty against human suffering. Max suddenly stood, ears perked toward the window. A moment later, Ethan heard it too, the distant sound of a helicopter. Help was coming, whether summoned or by routine forest patrol. "They're coming," Ethan announced, turning back to Sarah and Warner. "We need to get her outside where they can see us." As they prepared to move Sarah again, Warner paused, reaching into his backpack. Instead of the recorder Ethan had glimpsed earlier, he pulled out a photograph. A smiling teenage boy with Warner's eyes and a brightness that transcended the faded image. "This is Aiden," he said, showing it to Sarah. "He would have turned 21 this year." Sarah studied the photo with tears in her eyes. "He has your smile," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Daniel." Truly. The simple exchange, a moment of shared humanity between supposed enemies, affected Ethan deeply. How many times in Afghanistan had he witnessed the opposite transformation, as grief calcified into generations of hatred and revenge? Yet here, in this remote cabin, he was witnessing something rare and precious, the choice to break that cycle. The helicopter's rhythmic thumping grew louder. Warner carefully helped Ethan lift Sarah, while Max circled anxiously, understanding something significant was happening. Together they carried her into the clearing outside the cabin, where the helicopter would have space to land. As they waited, Max pressed against Sarah's side, his loyalty unwavering, despite the noise and commotion of the approaching rescue. Ethan noticed Warner watching the dog with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "He never gave up on her," Warner observed quietly. "Some bonds can't be broken," Ethan replied, thinking of Ajax. "Not even by death." The helicopter descended into the clearing, whipping the surrounding vegetation with powerful downdrafts. Medical personnel jumped out before it had fully landed, rushing toward Sarah with professional urgency. Max barked anxiously as strangers approached his human, but stayed disciplined, allowing them to work. As the medics prepared Sarah for transport, a park ranger approached Ethan and Warner, notepad in hand. "Can either of you tell me what happened?" he asked, surveying the unusual group with obvious curiosity. Warner stepped forward, shoulders squared. "I can," he said firmly. "I'm responsible." Ethan watched as Warner gave his statement, truthful, unvarnished, and full of remorse. There was a dignity in his confession that spoke to the man he might have been before grief warped his path, the man he might become again. The medics were ready to load Sarah into the helicopter. Max became agitated, trying to follow as they lifted her stretcher. "Sir, we can't take the dog," one medic shouted over the rotor noise. Sarah, barely conscious, reached out a weak hand toward Max. "Please," she begged. "He saved my life." The medics exchanged looks, clearly weighing protocol against compassion. Ethan stepped forward, "The dog is critical to her recovery," he stated with the authority he'd once used as a combat medic. "He's a service animal." The lie came easily, justified by the distress in both Sarah and Max's expressions. After a moment's hesitation, the lead medic nodded. "Keep him controlled," he ordered. "Any problem, and he's out." As they loaded Sarah and Max into the helicopter, Warner turned to Ethan, extending his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for stopping me from making the worst mistake of my life." Ethan accepted the handshake, recognizing in Warner's eyes the same haunted gratitude he'd seen in soldiers pulled back from moral edges. "We all need someone to block our path sometimes," he replied. The ranger approached Warner again. "Sir, I'll need you to come with me. There will be questions about your statement." Warner nodded, accepting the consequences that awaited him. Before following the ranger, he looked back at the helicopter where Sarah was being secured for transport. "Tell her," he began, then stopped, seemingly overwhelmed by everything left unsaid. "Tell her Aiden would have forgiven her. And maybe someday I can too." As the helicopter lifted off with Sarah and Max, Ethan stood in the clearing, watching it grow smaller against the brightening sky. The day had begun with him alone in the forest, seeking solitude through his camera lens. Now he found himself irrevocably connected to strangers through an act of desperate canine trust and human compassion. For the first time in years, the weight of his combat memories seemed lighter, not gone, but balanced by something new. Perhaps this was what his therapist had meant, about finding purpose after trauma. Perhaps Max wasn't the only one who had made an unexpected rescue today. The hospital corridor gleamed under fluorescent lights as Ethan paced outside the surgical suite, his boots leaving faint muddy tracks on the polished floor. 12 hours had passed since the helicopter evacuation. Sarah had been rushed directly to surgery upon arrival, her condition critical from blood loss and trauma. Max sat unnaturally still beside a plastic chair, his amber eyes fixed on the doors through which Sarah had disappeared. "Never seen a dog allowed in a hospital before," remarked an elderly volunteer pushing a magazine cart. "Must be special." "He saved her life," Ethan replied simply. The woman nodded as if this explained everything and continued down the hallway. The truth was more complex. Ethan had employed every bit of his military authority and persuasive skills to keep Max present, arguing for his status as a therapeutic service animal, signing liability waivers, even threatening to leave when an administrator suggested the dog be taken to animal control. Something in Ethan couldn't bear the thought of separating the pair, especially after witnessing their extraordinary bond in the forest. A surgeon emerged through the double doors, surgical cap still in place, expression revealing the fatigue of a lengthy procedure. Ethan straightened immediately. "Mr. Miller? You came in with Miss Anderson?" "Yes, how is she?" "Stable for now. We've repaired the femoral artery damage and set the fractures. The blood loss was significant. She'll need time to recover." The surgeon glanced at Max with mild disapproval. "Is that her service dog?" "Yes," Ethan answered without hesitation. The lie felt justified. Max had provided more genuine service than many certified animals. "Well, keep him out of the recovery room for now. Ms. Anderson will be unconscious for several more hours. You should get some rest yourself. You look nearly as bad as my patient." Ethan nodded, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion. His clothes were still damp and mud-stained, his hands bearing the dried blood of Sarah's wounds. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the rescue was fading, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its wake. "Come on, Max," he said, patting his thigh. The dog looked at him, then back at the surgical doors, clearly reluctant to leave. "She's going to be okay." "We'll come back." After a moment's hesitation, Max rose and followed Ethan toward the exit. In the hospital parking lot, Ethan realized he had no transportation. His truck was still at the forest viewpoint miles away. The absurdity of his situation struck him suddenly. Standing in a hospital parking lot with a dog that wasn't his, waiting for a woman he'd met only today, with no clear plan beyond the immediate crisis. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. The park ranger from the clearing confirming they'd secured his vehicle and equipment. Another text followed with a location where he could collect his belongings. Ethan stared at the screen, momentarily overwhelmed by the practical aspects of life that continued despite the day's emotional crucible. A taxi took them to a pet-friendly motel near the hospital. The desk clerk raised eyebrows at Ethan's disheveled appearance, but asked no questions when he paid cash for 2 nights. In the small, anonymous room, Ethan showered mechanically, washing away the physical evidence of the day's events, while his mind continued to process the emotional aftermath. Max refused food, but drank water before settling vigilantly by the door, as if planning their return to Sarah. Ethan recognized the behavior. Ajax had maintained similar watchfulness during dangerous deployments. "She's going to be okay," Ethan told Max, unsure if he was reassuring the dog or himself. "The doctors are taking care of her now." As exhaustion finally claimed him, Ethan dreamed of Afghanistan, not the usual nightmares of explosions and loss, but strangely peaceful images of Ajax running through sunlit fields. He woke, disoriented at dawn, to find Max standing alertly beside the bed, clearly ready to return to the hospital. "All right, buddy," Ethan yawned, reaching for his clothes. "Let's go check on her." The morning shift nurse seemed less concerned about Max's presence than her night counterparts had been. She directed them to a private room in the ICU where Sarah had been transferred post-surgery. "She was asking for her dog earlier," the nurse added. "Still pretty groggy from anesthesia, but she's been worried about him." Sarah lay propped against white pillows, her skin nearly matching their pallor. Various monitors tracked her vital signs, while IV lines delivered fluids and medication. Her injured leg was elevated, encased in a temporary cast. Despite the clinical setting, her face brightened visibly when Max entered the room. "Max," she whispered, extending a trembling hand. The dog approached cautiously, mindful of the tubes and equipment, before gently placing his head beneath her palm. The connection between them was palpable, a silent communication that transcended words. "He wouldn't leave the hospital yesterday," Ethan explained, taking a seat in the visitor's chair. "Pretty sure he would have bitten anyone who tried to take him away." Sarah smiled weakly. "He's very protective. Always has been." Her gaze shifted to Ethan, studying him properly for the first time since their forest encounter. "You stayed, too." It wasn't a question, but Ethan felt compelled to answer anyway. Seemed like the right thing to do. The simplicity of his response belied the complexity of his motivations, a mixture of duty, compassion, and something less definable that had awakened during their shared ordeal. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, "for believing Max, for helping me, for," she hesitated, "for handling Daniel compassionately." At the mention of Warner, Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "He's been arrested." "The ranger told me they're holding him on assault charges." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, a pained expression crossing her face that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. "He was wrong about me, but not wrong about what happened to his son. The trial was mismanaged. Data was manipulated. That doesn't justify what he did, Ethan pointed out. No, she agreed. But grief doesn't follow logical paths. Her gaze drifted to the window, where morning light filtered through Venetian blinds. I understand his need to blame someone. After my husband and son died, I wanted someone responsible too. The drunk driver who hit them was killed instantly, so there wasn't even anyone to direct my anger toward. Max whined softly, sensing her distress. Sarah stroked his head absently, finding comfort in the familiar texture of his fur. The police came by earlier, she continued. They wanted my statement about what happened. I told them Daniel didn't push me, that I fell while trying to get away. Ethan frowned. That's technically true, but he followed you there, intending harm. His intention was to confront me, not to kill me, Sarah corrected gently. The distinction matters to me, even if it doesn't to the law. She sighed, wincing slightly at the movement. He lost his son, Ethan. Prison won't bring Aiden back or heal Daniel's grief. Ethan recognized the compassion in her perspective, though part of him, the protective part forged through military service, bristled at the thought of Warner escaping consequences. He had seen too many cases where mercy was mistaken for weakness. "What will you do now?" he asked, changing the subject. "After you recover?" "Go home. Continue volunteering at the shelter. Try to remember to check the trail weather reports before hiking," she added with a small smile. "What about you? Do you have somewhere to be?" The question caught Ethan off guard. His nomadic lifestyle since the divorce had been deliberately unstructured. No commitments, no expectations, no attachments beyond his camera and memories. "My schedule's pretty flexible," he replied vaguely. Before Sarah could respond, a doctor entered the room, accompanied by a hospital administrator whose gaze immediately fixed on Max. "Ms. Anderson, I understand you're feeling stronger this morning?" "That's excellent," the doctor began, reviewing the chart in his hands. "However, I need to discuss your discharge planning. Given your injuries and living situation, we can't release you directly home. You'll need rehabilitation care first." Sarah's expression fell. "For how long?" "At least 3 weeks, possibly longer," the doctor replied. "You'll need assistance with basic activities until you're mobile again. We've contacted Spring Valley Care Center about a temporary placement." "A nursing home?" Sarah's voice wavered slightly. Max sensed her distress, pressing closer to the bed. "A rehabilitation facility," the administrator corrected smoothly. "And I must inform you that animals are not permitted there, even service animals, due to other patients' allergies and infection control protocols." Sarah's hand tightened in Max's fur. "I can't be separated from him for weeks. He needs me." "Perhaps a neighbor could care for him?" suggested the doctor, already moving toward the door, clearly considering the matter resolved. "I don't have family nearby," Sarah protested. "Max has special needs. His past trauma makes him anxious with strangers." The administrator's expression remained professionally sympathetic, but unmoved. "I understand this is difficult, but your medical needs must take priority. The social worker will visit this afternoon to finalize arrangements." After they departed, silence filled the room. Sarah stared at the ceiling, visibly fighting tears, while Max remained pressed against the bed, as if physically resisting their impending separation. Ethan watched them both, feeling an uncomfortable pressure building in his chest. The weight of an unspoken solution he was reluctant to voice. He had maintained careful distance from entanglements since returning from Afghanistan, avoiding precisely the type of responsibility now presenting itself. "I could take him," he heard himself say, surprising himself as much as Sarah. "Just temporarily, until you're released. My truck has plenty of room and I don't have any immediate assignments." Sarah turned to him, hope and uncertainty mingling in her expression. "You'd do that? You barely know us." The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. He had known them for less than 24 hours, yet felt more connected to this woman and her dog than to people he'd known for years. Perhaps trauma created its own kind of intimacy, a shared vulnerability that bypassed normal relationship timelines. "Max trusted me in the forest," he said simply. "I should return the favor." "He's not always easy," Sarah warned. "The abuse he suffered left scars beyond the physical ones. He has nightmares, anxiety around certain triggers." Ethan smiled faintly. "We have that in common, then." Their eyes met in a moment of recognition, two souls familiar with the landscape of trauma, speaking a language most civilians couldn't understand. In Max's alert posture, Ethan recognized the same hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat zones and isolated in civilian life. "My house keys are in my hiking pack," Sarah said after a pause. "There's a spare bedroom you could use, rather than staying in a motel. Max would be more comfortable in familiar surroundings." The offer represented more than practical logistics. It was an extension of trust from a woman who had every reason to be wary of strangers after her forest encounter. Ethan felt the significance of it settle on his shoulders, both weighty and somehow right. "I'd need to get my truck and equipment from the ranger station first," he replied, tacitly accepting. A soft knock interrupted them as a nurse entered with medication. "Visiting hours end at 9, she informed Ethan while checking Sarah's IV lines. "But they start again at 10 tomorrow morning." Sarah looked at Max anxiously. "Can he stay until then? Please, he's not disruptive." The nurse hesitated, glancing between Sarah's pleading expression and Max's dignified posture. "Dr. Winters doesn't usually make rounds until later," she said with deliberate vagueness. "I don't see any reason to disturb you before then." After she left, Sarah exhaled with visible relief. "Max has that effect on people, making them bend rules they never thought they'd bend." "He's persuasive," Ethan agreed, remembering how the dog's unusual behavior had convinced him to follow a strange animal into the forest. "I'll go retrieve my truck this afternoon and pick up anything you need from your house. Max can stay here until the last possible moment." As if understanding the conversation, Max settled more comfortably beside Sarah's bed, his watchful gaze occasionally shifting between her and the door, as if assessing potential threats. In that protective posture, Ethan saw echoes of Ajax, the same intelligent devotion, the same intuitive understanding of human vulnerability. The neurosurgeon arrived for afternoon rounds, examining Sarah thoroughly before delivering his assessment. "Your recovery is progressing well, but you've got a long road ahead. The femur fractures will require extensive physical therapy, and we're still monitoring for potential complications from the blood loss." Sarah nodded stoically. "When can I go home?" "Not for several weeks, I'm afraid. Even with home health assistance, you'll need a level of care we can't provide on an outpatient basis initially." The surgeon's expression softened slightly. "I understand your dog is important to you, but your recovery must be the priority now." After he departed, Sarah turned to Ethan with determination in her eyes. "There's something I need you to do, besides caring for Max," she said. "Something important." "What is it?" In my home office, there's a blue file labeled Meridian Trial Documentation. I need you to find it and take it to Daniel's attorney. Her voice was steady, despite her evident fatigue. It contains evidence that I tried to stop the trial. Internal memos, my formal objections, correspondence with the FDA. It won't bring Aiden back, but it might help Daniel understand that someone did try to prevent what happened. Ethan studied her face, surprised by her continued concern for the man who had effectively caused her current condition. You really want to help him? After what he did? Sarah's expression reflected a complex mixture of emotions, compassion, regret, and a deep weariness that transcended her physical injuries. Carrying hatred is exhausting, Ethan. I learned that after losing my family. Daniel deserves to know the truth, even if it comes too late to prevent the damage we've both suffered. Her words resonated uncomfortably with thoughts Ethan had been avoiding since his military discharge. About forgiveness. About moving forward. About the exhausting weight of maintaining emotional fortifications against the world. I'll find it, he promised, rising from his chair. You should rest now. I'll be back in the morning with whatever you need from home. Sarah nodded gratefully, her eyelids growing heavy as medication and exhaustion claimed her. Max knows where everything is, she murmured, her voice fading. He'll show you. As Ethan prepared to leave, arranging with the surprisingly accommodating nurse for Max to remain until evening, he reflected on the strange turn his solitary life had taken in less than 24 hours. He had entered the forest seeking isolation through his camera lens, only to find himself drawn into an intricate human drama of grief, vengeance, and unexpected connection. The ranger station was bustling with activity when Ethan arrived to collect his vehicle and equipment. Park employees were coordinating with police, processing the scene of Sarah's accident with professional efficiency. Ethan provided additional details for their report, carefully omitting any mention of his combat background or the more nuanced interactions with Warner in the cabin. "The dog really led you to her?" asked a young ranger, visibly impressed. "Like something out of a Lassie movie." He knew exactly what he was doing, Ethan confirmed, remembering Max's deliberate behavior. Smart animal. "Lucky for the lady he found you," the ranger commented. "We've had 3 fatalities on these trails in the past decade. People getting lost or injured in remote areas without anyone knowing where to look." The sobering statistics followed Ethan as he drove toward Sarah's address, which he'd obtained from her hospital registration. The forest had nearly claimed another life yesterday, would have succeeded without Max's extraordinary intervention. The parallel to his military experiences, where survival often hinged on split-second decisions and unexpected alliances, wasn't lost on him. Sarah's home stood at the end of a gravel driveway, partially hidden by towering pines. The modest ranch-style house showed signs of careful maintenance despite its age. Flower beds recently weeded, gutters clean, a well-used porch swing facing the sunset. It wasn't the sterile pharmaceutical executive's mansion Warner had probably imagined in his vengeful fantasies, but the comfortable dwelling of someone who lived modestly within her means. Using Sarah's keys, Ethan entered cautiously, feeling like an intruder despite her explicit permission. The interior revealed a life of quiet dignity. Bookshelves filled with veterinary texts and nature photography, simple furniture arranged for comfort rather than style, framed photographs documenting a family history that had ended abruptly 5 years earlier. On the refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like dog bones, were photographs of Max, newly rescued and fearful, then gradually transforming in subsequent images to the confident animal Ethan had encountered in the forest. The visual timeline of his rehabilitation spoke to Sarah's patience and dedication. The home office was exactly where Sarah had described: a small converted bedroom containing a desk, filing cabinet, and walls lined with certificates and professional acknowledgments. The blue file wasn't difficult to locate. It sat prominently on the desk, as if Sarah had been reviewing it recently. Ethan hesitated before opening it, feeling uncomfortably like a voyeur into private grief. The file contained exactly what Sarah had described: internal company memos with her increasingly urgent concerns highlighted, formal safety objection forms bearing her signature and rejected stamps, correspondence with regulatory agencies. The documentation painted a clear picture of a scientist fighting a losing battle against corporate priorities. One item particularly caught Ethan's attention: a handwritten note attached to a formal resignation letter addressed to families of trial participants. In it, Sarah apologized for her inability to prevent the trial's continuation despite emerging safety concerns, offering her personal contact information and a promise to provide any information that might help them understand what had happened to their loved ones. The personal nature of the note, its evident sincerity, made Warner's misdirected vengeance seem all the more tragic. Here was the very accountability he had sought, offered freely years ago, somehow lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of corporate damage control. Ethan carefully replaced the documents, securing the file in his camera bag. He would fulfill Sarah's request, though the wisdom of providing Warner with this information while criminal charges were pending remained questionable. But he understood her motivation. The truth, however painful, was preferable to destructive misconceptions. In the kitchen, he found Max's food and supplies exactly where Sarah had described them, along with detailed written instructions for the dog's care: feeding schedule, medication for occasional anxiety, favorite toys, and commands he responded to best. The thoroughness reflected both her scientific mind and deep affection for the animal. As evening approached, Ethan returned to the hospital to collect Max as promised. The dog seemed to understand the arrangement, following Ethan with reluctant acceptance after a lengthy goodbye with Sarah. In the truck, Max sat rigidly in the passenger's seat, his posture conveying clear displacement anxiety. "Just temporary, buddy," Ethan assured him, feeling slightly foolish for conversing with a dog, yet compelled by the animal's evident intelligence. "We'll visit her every day until she comes home." At Sarah's house, Max immediately conducted a methodical inspection of every room, as if verifying nothing had changed in his absence. Satisfied, he settled in Sarah's bedroom, resting his head on the quilt with a deep sigh. The dog's evident mourning for his absent human struck Ethan powerfully, a mirror to his own experiences of separation and loss. "She's coming back," Ethan said gently, sitting beside Max on the floor. "I promise." Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded Ethan that night. The guest bedroom felt unnaturally quiet after months of falling asleep to forest sounds in his truck or tent. Around midnight, he heard Max's nails clicking on hardwood as the dog made restless circuits through the house. Shortly after, a weight settled against Ethan's door. Max had positioned himself as sentry, unwilling to fully relax in Sarah's absence. Morning brought a measure of equilibrium as they established a tentative routine: breakfast, a brief walk around the property, then the drive to the hospital where Max transformed from anxious to purposeful the moment he entered Sarah's room. Ethan found himself welcomed into their established dynamic, his presence accepted as necessary under the circumstances. Sarah looked marginally stronger, though pain lines remained etched around her eyes. Her medical team had confirmed transfer to the rehabilitation facility within days, a prospect she clearly dreaded, despite understanding its necessity. "Did you find the file?" she asked, after the nurse completed morning assessments. "Yes. Are you sure you want me to take it to Warner's attorney? He's facing criminal charges because of what he did to you." Sarah's expression remained resolute. "I'm sure. The truth matters more than punishment. Daniel deserves to know what really happened, even if it doesn't change his legal situation." Ethan nodded, respecting her decision, even if he didn't fully understand it. "I'll find his attorney today." As promised, Ethan located the public defender representing Warner, delivering the file with minimal explanation beyond Sarah's wish that Daniel received the information. The attorney's skepticism was evident, but professional courtesy prevailed as she accepted the documents. "My client maintains that Ms. Anderson's fall was accidental," she noted, clearly establishing Warner's legal position. "She doesn't dispute that," Ethan replied carefully. "She just wants him to have the full story about his son's clinical trial." The attorney studied Ethan with practiced assessment. "You're not family or her attorney. Why are you involved in this?" The question was reasonable, yet difficult to answer. How could he explain the strange alchemy of circumstance, trauma, and connection that had drawn him into Sarah and Max's lives? How his solitary existence had been unexpectedly interrupted by a desperate dog who somehow recognized a kindred, wounded soul. "Right place, right time," he said simply. Sometimes that's enough. In the following days, Ethan settled into an unexpected role as caretaker, not just for Max, but for the practical aspects of Sarah's interrupted life. He collected her mail, watered her plants, and coordinated with her volunteer supervisor at the animal shelter to explain her absence. Each task connected him more deeply to the life of this woman he barely knew, yet felt increasingly responsible toward. Max gradually accepted Ethan's presence, moving from tolerance to cautious trust. They developed evening rituals, walks along the property perimeter, simple games of fetch that seemed to comfort them both. Quiet moments on the porch, where Ethan found himself talking aloud about Afghanistan, about Ajax, about the isolation he'd cultivated since returning home. Max listened with the non-judgmental attention that made dogs such effective therapy animals, his intelligent eyes seemingly understanding more than any human counselor had. During hospital visits, Ethan observed the extraordinary bond between Sarah and Max, how the dog anticipated her needs, positioned himself to minimize her pain when moving, remained attuned to her emotional state with uncanny precision. It was a relationship built on mutual rescue, each having saved the other from different forms of despair. On the day before Sarah's scheduled transfer to rehabilitation, Ethan arrived at the hospital to find a police detective interviewing her. Max sat alertly beside the bed, his posture protective but calm. "Mr. Miller," the detective acknowledged as Ethan entered, "I was just informing Miss Anderson that the district attorney has agreed to reduce charges against Daniel Warner from aggravated assault to criminal endangerment, contingent on her continued cooperation." Sarah nodded tiredly. "I've told Detective Harrison that I support the reduced charges and that I won't pursue civil damages." The detective looked uncomfortable with her leniency. "Ms. Anderson, I understand your compassion, but Mr. Warner's actions could have killed you. The evidence suggests premeditation." "Daniel lost his son," Sarah replied simply. "Nothing the justice system does to him could possibly add to that punishment." She glanced meaningfully at Ethan. "Did you deliver the file?" "Yes. His attorney has it." Detective Harrison frowned slightly. "What file is this?" "Personal correspondence," Sarah answered, before Ethan could respond. "Documentation of my efforts to protect trial participants like Daniel's son. It doesn't change what happened in the forest, but it provides context that might help him find some closure." After the detective departed, Sarah sank back against her pillows, the conversation having clearly depleted her limited energy. Max immediately shifted position, resting his head gently on the edge of the bed, within reach of her hand. "You don't owe Warner forgiveness," Ethan said quietly. "Forgiveness isn't about what's owed," Sarah replied, stroking Max's fur. "It's about what's needed, for both parties." She studied Ethan's face carefully. "You haven't forgiven yourself for something." "I recognize the signs." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truths Ethan had been avoiding. "We're talking about you, not me," Sarah smiled faintly. Deflection, another sign. Her expression grew serious. "Tomorrow they're moving me to Spring Valley. 3 weeks minimum, they say. I've been thinking about what that means for Max. And for you." "We're managing fine," Ethan assured her. "Your house is comfortable, and Max is adjusting to the situation." "That's just it," Sarah said hesitantly. "This situation is temporary, but I've been wondering if it needs to be." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You mentioned not having anywhere specific to be, living out of your truck. And I've noticed how you are with Max, patient, understanding. He responds to you in a way I've rarely seen with anyone besides myself." Ethan tensed, sensing where the conversation was heading. "Sarah, just listen," she interrupted gently. "I'm not getting any younger, and this injury is a stark reminder of my limitations. Max deserves security, someone who understands him, who can care for him if something happens to me." She took a deep breath. "The guest room is yours for as long as you want it, not just until I come home, but beyond that, if you wanted." The offer hung in the air between them. Not charity, but something more profound. An invitation to belong somewhere, to be needed. The very things Ethan had been avoiding since his discharge, convinced his damaged psyche made him unfit for normal human connections. "You barely know me," he protested weakly. "I know enough," Sarah replied with surprising certainty. "I know you followed a strange dog into the forest to help someone you'd never met. I know you kept Max with me when hospital rules said otherwise. I know you've taken care of my home and my dog without being asked." She smiled slightly. "Character reveals itself in crisis, Ethan. Yours has been revealing itself since the moment Max found you." Before Ethan could formulate a response, a nurse entered to administer Sarah's evening medication, effectively ending the conversation. As visiting hours concluded, Ethan and Max prepared to leave, with the promise to return before her transfer in the morning. In the truck, Max seemed to sense Ethan's emotional turmoil, pressing closer than usual in the passenger seat. The dog's simple presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that connection didn't always require words or explanations. Back at Sarah's house, Ethan wandered restlessly from room to room, considering her unexpected offer. The prospect of stability both attracted and terrified him. He had maintained deliberate transience since his discharge, convinced he was safer in isolation, safer for others when he kept moving. The nightmares, the occasional flashbacks, the hypervigilance, all seemed incompatible with normal domestic life. Yet something about this particular household, with its quiet dignity and history of healing damaged souls, resonated with possibilities he had long since dismissed. In Max he recognized a kindred spirit, another warrior carrying invisible wounds, who had nonetheless found purpose and connection through Sarah's patient care. As if conjured by his thoughts, Max appeared in the hallway, carrying something in his mouth. He dropped it at Ethan's feet, a weathered tennis ball, clearly a favorite toy given its condition. The simple gesture of trust and invitation struck Ethan powerfully. He knelt to retrieve the ball, and for the first time since entering Sarah's home, felt not like a temporary caretaker, but like someone who might belong. "Okay, buddy," he said softly, bouncing the ball once in his palm. "Let's play." Sarah's transfer to Spring Valley Rehabilitation Center unfolded with clinical efficiency. Medical charts exchanged, vital signs monitored, wheelchair protocols followed. What the process lacked in humanity, it made up for in medical thoroughness. Ethan and Max watched from the hospital room doorway as orderlies prepared her for transport, her few personal items already packed in a small duffel bag. 3 weeks, Sarah reminded Max, cupping his face between her palms. The dog's expression conveyed more understanding than seemed possible, a depth of comprehension that transcended typical animal cognition. "Be good for Ethan. I'll be home before you know it." The goodbye was painful to witness. Max whined softly, attempting to follow as they wheeled Sarah toward the elevator. Hospital policy prevented him from accompanying her to the rehabilitation facility, a separation that seemed unnecessarily cruel given their evident interdependence. Ethan held Max's collar firmly, murmuring reassurances that felt hollow even as he spoke them. "She'll be back," he promised, as Max strained against his hold, watching Sarah disappear behind closing elevator doors. "We'll visit her as often as they allow." In the parking lot, Max refused to enter the truck, instead sitting stubbornly facing the hospital entrance. His loyalty was both heartbreaking and inconvenient, requiring Ethan to physically lift the 70-pound dog into the passenger seat. Even then, Max pressed his nose against the window, amber eyes fixed on the hospital as they drove away. "I know, buddy," Ethan said quietly. "I don't like it either." The rehabilitation center was located on the outskirts of town, a modern facility with landscaped grounds that couldn't quite disguise its institutional nature. Ethan had researched their visitation policies thoroughly. Pets were prohibited inside, but outdoor visits in the garden area were permitted during specific hours. It wasn't ideal, but it would allow Max and Sarah to maintain contact during her recovery. The emptiness of Sarah's house felt more pronounced after her official transfer, as if her temporary absence had become weightier with medical bureaucracy. Max roamed restlessly from room to room, checking windows and doors as though expecting Sarah to appear at any moment. His anxiety manifested in small behavioral changes, decreased appetite, interrupted sleep, prolonged periods of watchful stillness. Ethan recognized the symptoms from his own experience with traumatic separation. In Afghanistan, he had witnessed similar behaviors in military dogs temporarily separated from their handlers, the canine equivalent of hypervigilance and attachment distress. His training had taught him to respect these emotions rather than dismiss them as mere animal instinct. "She's safe," he assured Max during their evening walk around the property perimeter. "Just not here right now." The rehabilitation center's outdoor visitation area proved to be a small courtyard with bench seating and container gardens. Pleasant enough, but lacking privacy. When Ethan and Max arrived for their first scheduled visit, Sarah was already waiting, seated in a wheelchair with her injured leg extended before her. Despite the institutional surroundings, her face brightened visibly at the sight of them. Max's reaction was immediate and profound, a full-body wiggle of joy followed by careful restraint as he approached Sarah, seemingly conscious of her injuries. He pressed against her uninjured side, making small whimpering sounds that conveyed both happiness and distress. "Oh, I've missed you too," Sarah murmured, burying her fingers in his fur. "Have you been good for Ethan?" "He's been fine," Ethan answered, taking a seat beside her. "Not eating as well as he should, but the vet said that's normal under the circumstances." Sarah's expression reflected concern. "You took him to Dr. Matthews?" "Yesterday, just for a checkup. He suggested some dietary supplements to help during the separation period." Ethan hesitated before adding, "He remembered Max from before. Said his progress with you has been remarkable given his background." Sarah nodded, her hand never leaving Max's fur. "The first year was difficult. He wouldn't let anyone touch him. Had panic attacks during thunderstorms. Resource guarded his food. Patience was the only approach that worked. The parallel to human trauma recovery wasn't lost on Ethan. He thought of his own struggles, the nightmares, the startle responses, the emotional numbness that had contributed to his divorce. The patience Sarah had shown Max was often lacking in human relationships, where expectations of getting over it typically prevailed. "The doctors say I'm making good progress," Sarah continued, gesturing toward her injured leg. "Physical therapy twice daily, occupational therapy for adaptive techniques. They're even letting me help with the facility's therapy dog program, though none of the animals are as impressive as Max." Her attempt at optimism didn't quite mask the underlying sadness in her voice. The rehabilitation center, for all its medical expertise, was still an institution, lacking the comforts and autonomy of home, forcing compliance with schedules and regulations designed for efficiency rather than emotional well-being. "Have you heard anything about Warner?" she asked, changing the subject. Ethan shook his head. "Nothing beyond what the detective told you. The reduced charges, the pending court date." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "I keep thinking about Aiden, his son. 16 is so young. Michael was 19 when the accident happened, and sometimes it still feels like he was just a child." Her voice caught slightly. "No parent should outlive their child. Whatever Daniel did to me, that fundamental truth remains." Her capacity for empathy, even toward someone who had caused her harm, continued to surprise Ethan. His military experience had conditioned him to see the world in more tactical terms. Threats versus safety, enemies versus allies. Sarah's perspective challenged this binary thinking, suggesting a more nuanced approach to human conflict. As their visitation time neared its end, a staff member approached to inform them that Sarah's physical therapy session would begin shortly. The interruption felt abrupt and impersonal, a reminder that here, medical schedules took precedence over emotional needs. "We'll come again tomorrow," Ethan promised as Max reluctantly separated from Sarah. Same time. Sarah nodded, her composure wavering slightly. Thank you for bringing him. Seeing him makes everything more bearable. She reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it briefly. Seeing you both does. The simple gesture of gratitude affected Ethan more deeply than expected. In the sterile environment of the rehabilitation center, with its medical equipment and institutional furnishings, Sarah's touch was a reminder of genuine human connection, something he had actively avoided since his military discharge. As days passed, they established a routine. Morning visits to the rehabilitation center, afternoons spent maintaining Sarah's property and managing household tasks, evenings devoted to gradually rebuilding Max's sense of security. The dog began to eat more regularly, though he still slept in Sarah's bedroom, maintaining their connection through familiar scents and spaces. Ethan's own sleeping patterns improved unexpectedly. The nightmares that had plagued him for years became less frequent, his hypervigilance gradually decreasing within the safety of Sarah's home. Something about the property's quiet rhythm, the bird feeders that required regular filling, the garden that needed occasional tending, Max's steady companionship, provided a structure that had been missing from his nomadic existence. On their 7th day of visitation, they arrived at the rehabilitation center to find Sarah unexpectedly absent from the courtyard. A nurse informed them that she had experienced a setback overnight, increased pain and swelling in her injured leg, necessitating additional diagnostic tests. "Can we see her?" Ethan asked, feeling Max tense beside him. "She's in radiology now," the nurse explained apologetically. "Doctor's orders are for complete rest afterward." "Perhaps tomorrow, if she's feeling stronger." The news sent a current of anxiety through Ethan, amplified by Max's immediate distress. The dog whined softly, pulling toward the building entrance as if determined to locate Sarah despite institutional barriers. "Come on, buddy," Ethan said gently, tugging the leash. "We'll come back tomorrow. She needs rest today." Max's reluctance to leave was palpable, requiring physical guidance back to the truck. Once home, he refused food entirely, spending hours stationed by the front window, alert for any sign of Sarah's return. His behavior mirrored the vigilant waiting that Ethan had observed in military working dogs, when handlers were temporarily absent, a combination of loyalty and anxiety that transcended simple animal attachment. That evening, Ethan received a call from the rehabilitation center. Sarah's condition had deteriorated. The swelling indicated a possible infection at the surgical site, requiring intravenous antibiotics and close monitoring. Visitation was suspended until her condition stabilized. "She's asking for Max," the nurse added quietly, her voice suggesting she recognized the unusual bond between patient and dog. "We can't allow animals in the medical wing, but she's quite distressed about him worrying." "Tell her he's okay," Ethan replied, watching Max's alert posture by the window. "Tell her we're both waiting for her to get better." After ending the call, Ethan sat beside Max on the floor, feeling an unexpected kinship in their shared concern. "She's sick," he explained, knowing the dog couldn't understand the words, but might comprehend the emotion behind them. "But they're helping her. We just have to wait." Max turned to study Ethan's face with unnerving intelligence, before pressing his head against Ethan's shoulder, a gesture of shared comfort that broke something open inside the former soldier. For the first time since Ajax died in Afghanistan, Ethan allowed himself to experience the full weight of animal companionship, the wordless understanding, the absence of judgment, the simple presence that asked nothing beyond reciprocal loyalty. "We'll get through this," he promised, wrapping an arm around Max's sturdy frame. "All of us." The night passed restlessly for both man and dog. Ethan's sleep was interrupted by memories not of Afghanistan, but of the forest rescue. Sarah's pale face, Warner's conflicted expression, Max's desperate determination. The three souls had been strangers days earlier, yet now seemed inextricably connected by circumstance and choice. Morning brought a text message from the rehabilitation center. Sarah's infection was responding to antibiotics, though her recovery timeline would likely be extended. Visitation remained restricted, but they would call when her condition allowed visitors again. The news provided relief, but intensified the strange limbo Ethan and Max occupied. Caretakers of an empty home, waiting for its owner's uncertain return. During their morning walk, Ethan noticed a police cruiser parked outside the local diner. Detective Harrison waved him over, gesturing toward an empty chair at his table. "How's Miss Anderson doing?" he asked as Ethan hesitantly joined him, Max settling vigilantly at his feet. "Infection complication," Ethan explained briefly. "They're treating it, but visits are suspended for now." Harrison nodded sympathetically. "Tough break. She seemed like a resilient lady, though." He stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "Thought you might want to know. Warner's been released on bail, pending trial. Conditions include no contact with Miss Anderson and remaining within county limits." The information triggered Ethan's protective instincts. Is that safe, given what he did? Court found him a low flight risk, minimal danger to the community, first-time offender, solid community ties. Harrison shrugged. "Personally, I'd have preferred remand, but the judge was swayed by character references and his clean record. The reduced charges helped, too." Ethan absorbed this development with mixed emotions. Sarah would likely approve of Warner's release. Her compassion extended even to the man who had caused her current suffering. But Ethan's military training had instilled a more cautious perspective regarding potential threats. "Thought I should tell you directly," Harrison continued, "since you're looking after Ms. Anderson's property. If he violates the no-contact order by showing up there, call immediately. Don't engage." "Understood," Ethan replied, his hand automatically dropping to Max's head. The dog remained calm but watchful, sensing the serious nature of the conversation. As they walked home, Ethan found himself scanning the surroundings with renewed vigilance. Warner's release represented a variable in an equation he had just begun to solve. The delicate balance of his unexpected role in Sarah and Max's life. Part of him recognized the irrationality of his concern. Warner had shown genuine remorse in the forest cabin, had ultimately helped save Sarah rather than harm her further. Yet the protective instinct remained, heightened by Sarah's current vulnerability. That evening, standing on Sarah's porch watching the sunset, Ethan heard a vehicle approaching on the gravel driveway. Max immediately went on alert, moving to Ethan's side with a low growl forming in his throat. The German Shepherd's reaction suggested the visitor wasn't familiar, not a neighbor or regular delivery person whom Max would recognize. The car that appeared was nondescript, a modest sedan that had seen better days. It parked at a respectful distance from the house, and Daniel Warner emerged slowly from the driver's seat. He remained beside his vehicle, making no move to approach the porch where Ethan and Max stood. "I'm not supposed to be here," Warner called, his voice carrying across the yard. "I know that. I just—" He hesitated, visibly struggling with his purpose. "I heard she's sick." "In the hospital again." Ethan maintained a neutral expression, one hand resting lightly on Max's collar. The dog's growl had subsided, but his body remained tense, ready to respond if necessary. "Rehabilitation center," Ethan corrected. "Infection complication. She's stable." Warner nodded, absorbing this information with evident relief. "Good. That's good." He reached into his car and retrieved something from the passenger seat, a small, potted plant with delicate white flowers. "My mother used to say, peace lilies were for healing. I thought maybe you could give it to her when you see her." The gesture was so unexpected, so incongruous with Warner's previous actions, that Ethan momentarily struggled to respond. The man before him bore little resemblance to the vengeful figure from the forest, his posture diminished, his expression haunted by something beyond ordinary remorse. "I read the file," Warner continued when Ethan remained silent. "The one she sent." "All this time, I thought." He shook his head, unable to complete the thought. 5 years, hating the wrong person. 5 years that could have been— His voice broke, and he placed the peace lily carefully on the hood of his car. "Just tell her I'm sorry. Not that it matters, but I'm sorry." As Warner turned to leave, Max suddenly pulled against Ethan's hold, not aggressively, but with clear purpose. Startled, Ethan released the collar, watching as the dog trotted down the porch steps and approached Warner with cautious assessment rather than hostility. Warner froze, clearly uncertain how to respond to the animal that had once growled so threateningly at him in the forest. "Hey there," he said softly, remaining perfectly still as Max circled him, sniffing deliberately. What happened next astonished Ethan. Max, after completing his inspection, sat directly in front of Warner, then extended his paw in the classic canine greeting gesture. It was a behavior Sarah had likely taught him, but its deployment in this specific context seemed almost preternaturally appropriate. A symbolic offering of truce from the being most dedicated to Sarah's protection. Warner looked from the extended paw to Ethan with naked disbelief. "Does he?" "He remembers you," Ethan confirmed, equally surprised by Max's behavior. "From the cabin. From helping her." Warner cautiously accepted the offered paw, the simple contact visibly affecting him. "Thank you," he whispered to the dog, then straightened and addressed Ethan again. "I won't come back. I just needed to." He gestured helplessly toward the peace lily. To do something that wasn't destructive for once. After Warner departed, Ethan brought the plant inside, placing it on Sarah's kitchen windowsill. Max stationed himself nearby, watching Ethan with that uncanny intelligence that continued to surprise him. "You're a better judge of character than most people," Ethan told the dog, marveling at Max's apparent ability to distinguish between Warner's past threat and present remorse. That night, Ethan dreamed not of combat, but of the forest cabin, the 3 damaged souls finding unexpected connection amid crisis. In the dream, Sarah spoke the same words she had in reality. "It's never too late to choose differently." The phrase followed him into waking, resonating with possibilities he had long since dismissed for his own life. The rehabilitation center called the next morning. Sarah's condition had improved enough to allow visitors again, though her projected release date had been pushed back by at least a week. Ethan gathered Max and the Peace Lily, driving to the facility with a mixture of anticipation and concern. They found Sarah in a different room than before, this one in the medical wing rather than the rehabilitation section. She looked smaller, somehow, against the white hospital linens, her usual vibrant energy diminished by illness and isolation. But her face brightened immediately at the sight of Max, who approached her bedside with gentle restraint, sensing her increased fragility. "There's my good boy," she murmured, reaching out a hand that now bore the bruising of repeated IV insertions. "I've missed you so much." Ethan placed the peace lily on her bedside table, debating whether to mention its source. Sarah noticed it immediately, her expression curious. "Warner brought it," Ethan explained, deciding transparency was the kindest approach. "He came by the house yesterday. Don't worry, he stayed outside. Just wanted to leave this for you. He said his mother told him they were for healing." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "He shouldn't have come. His bail conditions. He knows." "Said he won't return." Ethan hesitated before adding, "He read the file you sent. Said he spent 5 years hating the wrong person." Sarah absorbed this information silently, her fingers absently stroking Max's fur. "And what did you think, seeing him there?" The question was perceptive, targeting the complex reaction Ethan had experienced. "Initially, concerned about security. Then," he paused, considering, "I saw a broken man trying to make amends." Max saw it too, offered his paw after checking him out. "Did he?" Sarah smiled faintly. "Max has always been an excellent judge of character. Better than most humans." The visit continued with updates about her medical condition. The infection was responding to treatment, but had delayed her rehabilitation progress, potentially extending her stay by several weeks. She tried to maintain optimism, but Ethan detected the underlying distress in her voice. The institutional environment was wearing on her, the separation from home and Max taking an emotional toll beyond the physical challenges. "The house is fine," he assured her. "Everything's taken care of. Max and I have established a routine, though he'll be much happier when you're back." "And you?" Sarah asked directly. "Will you still be there when I return?" The question hung between them, an echo of her earlier invitation for him to stay beyond her recovery period. Ethan had deliberately avoided addressing it, uncertain of his capacity for the commitment it represented. "I'm not going anywhere while you need help," he answered carefully. Sarah studied his face, seeming to read the qualification in his response. "Needing help is temporary," she acknowledged. "Needing connection is permanent." She glanced at Max, who remained pressed against her side. "We all need anchors, Ethan. Even those of us who think we're better off drifting." The insight struck uncomfortably close to truths Ethan had been avoiding since his military discharge. How his nomadic lifestyle masked a deeper fear of attachment, of potential loss, of the vulnerability that genuine connection required. His camera lens had provided literal and figurative distance from a world that seemed too raw, too dangerous to engage with directly. Before he could formulate a response, a nurse entered to administer medication, effectively ending the conversation. As visiting hours concluded, Ethan and Max prepared to leave with a promise to return the following day. "Thank Daniel for the peace lily," Sarah said as they departed. "Tell him I understand what it means to live with regret. And that his mother was right. They are for healing." The message felt weighted with significance beyond its surface meaning, an acknowledgement of parallel journeys through grief and guilt, and the possibility of redemption that remained available to both Warner and by extension, to Ethan himself. That evening, as Ethan prepared dinner in Sarah's kitchen, with Max watching attentively from his designated spot near the refrigerator, his phone rang with an unfamiliar local number. "Mr. Miller, this is Nurse Jacobs from Spring Valley. There's been a change in Miss Anderson's condition." The professional calm in the woman's voice did little to soften the impact of her next words. "She's developed a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lung. We've transferred her to Memorial Hospital for emergency treatment." The world seemed to tilt slightly as Ethan processed this information. How serious is it?" "Critical, but stable. The doctors caught it early, which improves her chances significantly." The nurse paused before adding, "She was asking for you and Max before the ambulance arrived." "I thought you should know." After ending the call, Ethan stood motionless in the kitchen, the half-prepared meal forgotten as the implications of this new development washed over him. Pulmonary embolisms were serious complications, potentially fatal if not treated promptly. Sarah's relatively simple recovery had suddenly transformed into a life-threatening crisis. Max sensed the shift immediately, moving to press against Ethan's leg with a soft whine of inquiry. The dog's intuitive response to human distress was remarkable, a capacity for empathy that transcended species limitations. "She's sick," Ethan explained aloud, finding unexpected comfort in articulating the situation, even if Max couldn't understand the specific words. Really sick this time. Memorial Hospital's emergency department was chaotic when they arrived, medical staff moving with controlled urgency between treatment rooms. Ethan approached the reception desk, Max at his heel, already anticipating the institutional resistance to the dog's presence. "Sarah Anderson," he said to the harried clerk. "She was transferred here from Spring Valley with a pulmonary embolism." The clerk checked her computer. "She's in treatment now. Are you family?" "I'm her—" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to define his relationship to Sarah. Not family, not quite a friend, something undefined yet increasingly significant. "I'm responsible for her dog. She was asking for us." The clerk frowned at Max, clearly preparing to recite hospital policy regarding animals. Before she could speak, a passing doctor in scrubs interrupted. "Are you Ethan? With Max?" At Ethan's nod, he continued, "Ms. Anderson has been asking for you. She's stabilized, but quite anxious about the dog." He studied Max thoughtfully. "Normally, we don't allow animals, but under the circumstances—" "Follow me. Just keep him close." They were led to a treatment area where Sarah lay connected to various monitors, an oxygen mask covering her face. Despite her evident exhaustion, her eyes brightened at the sight of them. She removed the mask briefly to speak. "You came," she whispered, reaching for Max, who approached the bed with careful restraint, sensing the gravity of the situation. "Both of you." "Of course we did," Ethan replied, taking her other hand in his. The contact felt natural now, the awkwardness of their early interactions replaced by something more substantial. "How are you feeling?" "Scared," she admitted, replacing the oxygen mask momentarily before removing it again. "This wasn't in the recovery plan." The attempted humor couldn't disguise the fear evident in her eyes. Pulmonary embolisms were serious complications, often life-threatening, particularly in older patients still recovering from major trauma. The monitors surrounding her bed told a sobering story of medical intervention against mortality. "The doctor said they caught it early," Ethan reassured her, maintaining his hold on her hand. "That's important." Sarah nodded slightly, then looked at Max with unmistakable concern. "If something happens to me—" "Don't," Ethan interrupted firmly. "You're going to be fine." "We need to be practical," she insisted, her voice weakening. "Max needs someone who understands him, someone who won't give up when things get difficult." Her gaze held Ethan's with surprising intensity, despite her condition. "Promise me you'll take care of him. Not just temporarily. Permanently, if necessary." The request represented more than practical contingency planning. It was an expression of trust from someone who had experienced profound loss, who understood the value of careful stewardship for those left behind. Ethan felt the weight of it settle in his chest, alongside an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to experience fully since Ajax died in his arms in Afghanistan. Attachment. "I promise," he said, quietly, the words emerging with unexpected certainty. "But you're going to get through this. We'll be waiting when you do, both of us." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, whether from pain or emotion, impossible to determine. She replaced the oxygen mask, her hand still gripping Ethan's with surprising strength given her condition. A nurse approached, indicating that Sarah needed rest and treatment. Before leaving, Ethan pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so natural it surprised him only in retrospect, as he and Max returned to the waiting area. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. Max remained pressed against Ethan's leg in the uncomfortable hospital chair, occasionally raising his head when medical personnel passed by, as if hoping for news. Midnight came and went, the emergency department gradually quieting as the night shift settled into routine. Around 2 a.m, the doctor who had initially brought them to Sarah appeared in the waiting area doorway, his expression grave. "Mr. Miller?" "A moment, please." Ethan rose immediately, his heart racing with sudden fear. Max stood with him, sensing the tension in his posture. "Miss Anderson's condition has deteriorated," the doctor explained quietly. "The clot is larger than initially thought. We're administering thrombolytics, clot-busting medication, but there's significant strain on her cardiopulmonary system." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, though he already understood the implications from the doctor's tone. "It means we're doing everything possible, but you should prepare yourself for the possibility that she may not recover." The doctor's professional demeanor softened slightly. "She's been asking for you again. We don't normally allow non-family in critical care, but under the circumstances—" The unspoken acknowledgement of Sarah's isolation, no family members to call, no next of kin to notify, hung heavily between them. Ethan had become, by circumstance and choice, the closest thing to family she had besides Max. "Can the dog come too?" Ethan asked, knowing Sarah would want Max present if these were indeed her final hours. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Keep him close. If any other staff object, tell them Dr. Mercer approved it." The critical care room was unnervingly quiet compared to the bustle of the emergency department. Sarah lay connected to even more monitoring equipment, her breathing labored despite supplemental oxygen. Her eyes were closed when they entered, but opened at the sound of Max's nails clicking on the floor. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice barely audible without the oxygen mask, which had been replaced by a nasal cannula. "Both of you." "We're not going anywhere," Ethan assured her, pulling a chair close to her bedside. Max positioned himself where Sarah could see him without turning her head, his intelligent eyes fixed on her face. "I'm sorry," Sarah said after a moment, "for putting you in this position. You came to the forest for solitude, not all this." She gestured weakly at herself, the hospital room, the monitors tracking her precarious condition. "Don't apologize," Ethan replied firmly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The truth of the statement resonated beyond the immediate situation, a recognition that perhaps his solitary wandering had been leading him here all along, to this unexpected connection with a woman and a dog who had both experienced trauma and emerged with their capacity for trust remarkably intact. Sarah studied his face with the particular clarity that sometimes accompanies extreme physical states. "You've been running from something," she observed. "Not just Afghanistan, something specific." The perception was startling in its accuracy. Ethan had indeed been running, not just from the general trauma of combat, but from a specific moment that had shattered his sense of purpose and identity. "My service dog, Ajax," he admitted, the name still difficult to speak aloud. "He died saving my unit from an ambush. Took a bullet meant for me." The memory surfaced with painful clarity. Ajax's body collapsing mid-stride, the horrible sound he made, the weight of him in Ethan's arms during those final moments. I couldn't save him. After everything he did for us, I couldn't save him. Sarah's hand found his, her touch gentle despite her weakness. "Survivor's guilt," she murmured. "I know it well." After that, I couldn't. Ethan struggled to articulate the complexity of his reaction. Couldn't risk caring that much again. About anyone or anything. He glanced at Max, who remained vigilantly attentive beside the bed. Until recently. Sarah smiled faintly, understanding the implication. "Max has that effect on people. Breaks down their defenses." Her expression grew serious again. "If I don't make it—" "Sarah, let me finish," she interrupted with unexpected firmness. "If I don't make it, don't retreat again. Don't use losing me as another reason to isolate yourself." She squeezed his hand weakly. "Promise me you'll keep living. Keep connecting. Max will help you if you let him." The moment held the weight of a covenant, an exchange of promises between two souls who had found each other through improbable circumstances, mediated by the extraordinary animal who had brought them together. "I promise," Ethan whispered, recognizing in the commitment a fundamental shift in his approach to life after trauma. "But you have to promise to fight. To stay with us if you can." Sarah nodded slightly, her eyelids growing heavy with fatigue and medication. "I promise," she echoed, her voice fading as sleep claimed her. Throughout the night, Ethan maintained his vigil beside Sarah's bed, one hand holding hers, the other resting on Max's head. The dog remained extraordinarily still, as if understanding the gravity of the situation and his role within it. Occasionally, medical staff entered to check monitors and adjust medications, their professional efficiency softened by obvious compassion for the unusual trio. Dawn brought a subtle shift in Sarah's condition. Her breathing eased slightly, her color improved. The critical care doctor who examined her appeared cautiously optimistic. "The thrombolytics seem to be working," he informed Ethan. "Her oxygen saturation is improving, and the strain on her heart has decreased. She's not out of danger yet, but these are encouraging signs." The news brought a cautious relief. Ethan realized he had been holding his breath metaphorically for hours, waiting for either improvement or decline. Max seemed to sense the positive development, his posture relaxing slightly, though he remained attentive at Sarah's bedside. As morning progressed, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes recognizing Ethan and Max, other times lost in medication-induced confusion. During one lucid period, she gripped Ethan's hand with surprising strength. "Talk to me," she requested, her voice stronger than before. "About anything. The silence is too hospital-like." Ethan smiled at the description. "What should I talk about?" "Tell me about Ajax," she suggested. "Not how he died, how he lived." The request caught Ethan off guard. Few people had asked about Ajax's life. Most focused on his heroic death, or avoided the subject entirely, uncertain how to navigate the evident pain it caused. "He was stubborn," Ethan began, memories surfacing that had been deliberately suppressed. "Failed out of the formal canine program twice before a trainer recognized his potential. Too independent, they said. Wouldn't follow standard protocols." He smiled faintly at the recollection. "But that independence saved our unit multiple times. He thought for himself, made decisions based on conditions rather than just training." As he spoke, the tightness that usually accompanied thoughts of Ajax gradually eased. In its place came warmer memories, Ajax sleeping beside his cot in the barracks, the specific tilt of his head when Ethan used certain words, the extraordinary bond that had developed between them through shared danger and purpose. "He sounds remarkable," Sarah observed, her gaze drifting to Max, who listened attentively to the description of his fellow German shepherd. "They have old souls, I think. Deeper understanding than we give them credit for." The conversation continued intermittently as Sarah's energy allowed, shifting between memories, observations about Max, and careful avoidance of her current precarious condition. Throughout the exchange, Ethan realized something significant was occurring, not just Sarah's physical healing, but an emotional unburdening he had resisted since Ajax's death. By afternoon, Sarah's improvement was pronounced enough that her status was downgraded from critical to serious but stable. The possibility of recovery, which had seemed remote hours earlier, now appeared increasingly likely. Ethan felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, though caution prevented full relief. "You should go home," Sarah told him during a period of particular clarity. "Both of you. Get some real rest, food. I'm not going anywhere now." Though reluctant to leave, Ethan recognized the wisdom in her suggestion. Neither he nor Max had eaten properly for nearly 24 hours, and the uncomfortable hospital chair had left him with painful muscle spasms. "We'll be back first thing tomorrow," he promised, leaning down to press another kiss to her forehead, the gesture now familiar, uncomplicated by self-consciousness. "Keep fighting." "Count on it," she replied, with a shadow of her usual determination. As they left the hospital, Ethan felt the strange dissonance that often accompanies crisis resolution, the world continuing normally around them despite the emotional crucible they had just experienced. People entered and exited the hospital for routine appointments. Traffic flowed along nearby streets. Everyday life proceeded with indifferent consistency. At Sarah's house, Max immediately conducted his usual inspection of the property before settling in the living room, visibly exhausted but less anxious than during previous separations from Sarah. Perhaps he sensed the positive shift in her condition. Or perhaps he had simply developed greater trust in Ethan's assurances. Ethan fed Max, then himself, moving through these practical tasks with mechanical efficiency while his mind processed the events of the past 24 hours. Sarah's brush with mortality had crystallized something that had been gradually forming since the forest rescue. A recognition that his careful isolation had not, in fact, protected him from attachment or potential loss. It had merely prevented the connections that made vulnerability worthwhile. As he settled onto Sarah's couch, Max joining him with uncharacteristic physical closeness, Ethan felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief at Sarah's improvement, lingering fear about her recovery, and beneath these immediate concerns, a deeper realization about his own capacity for healing. "We're going to be okay," he told Max, the dog's head heavy against his leg. "All of us." For the first time since leaving the military, Ethan allowed himself to consider a future that included genuine connection, rather than strategic distance. A life where Ajax's memory could exist alongside new bonds, rather than precluding them. The possibility felt simultaneously terrifying and essential, like stepping from shadow into necessary light. With this tentative acceptance came profound exhaustion. Ethan closed his eyes, one hand resting on Max's steady flank, and surrendered to the deepest sleep he had experienced in years, dreamless, peaceful, unburdened by the hypervigilance that had been his constant companion since Afghanistan. The county courthouse stood imposingly against the clear autumn sky, its red brick facade and white columns projecting an air of timeless authority. Ethan adjusted his tie, a borrowed accessory that felt like a costume piece against his usual casual attire. Beside him on the courthouse bench, Max sat with uncharacteristic stillness, his service vest identifying him as a working animal rather than a pet, a minor deception that had allowed his presence at today's proceedings. "You're sure you want to do this?" Ethan asked Sarah, who sat on his other side, reviewing the statement she had prepared. 6 weeks had passed since her pulmonary embolism, 6 weeks of gradual recovery, physical therapy, and increasingly honest conversations about what had happened in the forest and everything that followed. Sarah nodded firmly, her color much improved, though she still relied on a cane for stability. "Daniel deserves a chance at redemption. My testimony might help provide that. Today was Warner's sentencing hearing. He had pled guilty to reduced charges of reckless endangerment and criminal trespassing, sparing Sarah the trauma of a trial, but still facing potential imprisonment. The district attorney had opposed her request to make a statement, arguing that victims typically advocated for harsher sentences rather than leniency. But Sarah had been adamant, and the judge had ultimately granted permission. "Miss Anderson?" A court officer approached, clipboard in hand. "They're ready for you now." Sarah rose slowly, accepting Ethan's steadying hand. Max flanked her other side, naturally falling into a supportive position without specific command. Together they formed an unusual trio: an elderly woman with a cane, a former soldier still bearing the invisible wounds of combat, and a scarred German shepherd whose military tattoo peeked through his fur. The courtroom was sparsely populated: a few journalists, court staff, the opposing attorneys. Warner sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched beneath a suit that hung loosely on his frame. He didn't turn as they entered, his gaze fixed on his folded hands. Judge Eleanor Harmon, a woman whose silver hair and stern demeanor suggested decades of judicial experience, acknowledged their entrance with a slight nod. "Ms. Anderson, I understand you wish to make a victim impact statement before sentencing?" "Yes, Your Honor."
Sarah's voice was steady as she moved to the designated podium, Ethan and Max remaining respectfully in the gallery's front row.
The court recognizes that victims of crime often suffer impacts beyond physical injury, Judge Harmon stated formally. You may proceed when ready. Sarah placed her prepared notes on the podium, but didn't immediately reference them. Instead, she looked directly at Warner, who finally raised his gaze to meet hers. 5 years ago, I lost my husband and son in a car accident, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. The driver who hit them died instantly, leaving me with no focus for my grief and anger. There was no trial, no sentencing hearing, no resolution. Just absence. She paused, collecting herself before continuing. During that same period, Daniel Warner lost his son Aiden to complications from a pharmaceutical trial I was professionally associated with. Unlike me, Daniel had somewhere to direct his pain toward the company, the executives who ignored safety warnings, and ultimately toward me. Warner's expression reflected visible distress at her words, his hands gripping the edge of the table. What happened in the forest that day was the collision of two broken people carrying unresolved grief, Sarah continued. When I fell, Daniel had a choice, to leave me there or to help. Despite years of anger directed at me, he chose to help. That choice matters to me, even if it came after the harm was done. Sarah glanced briefly at her notes before setting them aside entirely. Your Honor, I'm not here to minimize what happened. My injuries were serious, and the subsequent complications nearly cost me my life. But I am here to ask for something that might seem unusual: consideration of Daniel's capacity for redemption. The judge's expression remained neutral, though her attention was clearly focused on Sarah's unexpected approach. I've read Daniel's son's autopsy report, reviewed the trial data that was manipulated by executives, and confirmed my own failed attempts to halt the trial when safety concerns emerged. Sarah's voice wavered slightly before strengthening again. If our positions had been reversed, if someone I believed responsible for my son's death stood before me, I cannot honestly say I would have acted differently. Warner stared at her in visible disbelief, tears tracking silently down his face. Grief can distort our perception, can transform normally compassionate people into versions of themselves they don't recognize, Sarah continued. I believe Daniel Warner is essentially a good man who made terrible choices, while consumed by unprocessed loss. Prison will not help him heal that wound, nor will it undo what happened to me. She turned slightly to gesture toward Ethan and Max in the gallery. During my recovery, I've been fortunate to find support from unexpected sources, people and animals who understand trauma and the long path toward healing. I believe Daniel deserves a similar opportunity for restoration, not freedom from consequences, but a chance to make amends in ways that benefit others, rather than simply punishing him. Judge Harmon leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting a specific alternative sentence, Ms. Anderson? Community service with organizations supporting families who have lost children to medical negligence, Sarah replied without hesitation. Restricted communication with me through approved channels, so we might eventually discuss Aiden's case with proper professional boundaries. And mandatory grief counseling to address the underlying trauma that led to his actions. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly at the specificity of these recommendations. You've given this considerable thought. Considerable experience, Your Honor, Sarah corrected gently. I know what helped me survive loss, and what didn't. Isolation only deepened my grief. Connection, even painful, complicated connection, provided a path forward. As Sarah returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent, except for Warner's audible attempt to compose himself. Judge Harmon studied her notes thoughtfully before addressing the defendant directly. "Mr. Warner, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" Warner rose unsteadily, his voice rough with emotion. "Just that Ms. Anderson's capacity for forgiveness is something I don't deserve, but will spend the rest of my life trying to earn. Whatever sentence you impose, I accept it completely." Judge Harmon nodded, then delivered her decision. 3 years probation with strict conditions, including those Sarah had suggested, plus significant community service hours and restitution for Sarah's medical expenses. The sentence was notably lenient, given the potential penalties, a reflection of both Sarah's advocacy and the judge's own apparent belief in rehabilitative rather than purely punitive justice. As the proceedings concluded, Warner approached their bench hesitantly, flanked by his attorney. "Thank you," he said simply to Sarah. "I don't understand how you can show such compassion, but I'm grateful beyond words." "Understanding comes with time," Sarah replied. "We both lost children, Daniel. That creates a connection neither of us wanted, but both must acknowledge." Warner nodded, his gaze shifting briefly to Max, who watched him with alert intelligence, but no aggression. "Your dog remembered me at your house that day, remembered that I helped, not just that I caused harm. Animals see clearly what people often miss." "They do," Sarah agreed, one hand resting lightly on Max's head. "Better judges of character than most humans." After Warner departed with his attorney, Ethan helped Sarah navigate the courthouse steps toward the parking area. "You okay?" he asked, noting her thoughtful expression. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Better than I expected, actually. There's something liberating about choosing compassion over retribution. Not everyone would understand that choice." "I do," Ethan replied simply. Sarah smiled, recognizing the significance of his statement. In his military experience, retribution often masqueraded as justice, perpetuating cycles of violence rather than resolving underlying conflicts. His understanding of her perspective represented its own form of healing. The drive home was quiet, each absorbed in private reflections on the day's events. Max dozed in the back seat, his service vest removed now that its official purpose had been fulfilled. The autumn landscape blurred past the windows, trees shedding their summer foliage, fields transitioning to seasonal dormancy, the natural cycle of release and renewal playing out across the countryside. At Sarah's house, now comfortably occupied by all three of them, Ethan prepared coffee while Sarah settled in her favorite armchair, leg elevated as her physical therapist had instructed. The domestic routine had developed organically over the weeks of her recovery, his initially temporary presence gradually transforming into something more permanent, though neither had explicitly addressed the shift. "I've been thinking," Sarah began, accepting the coffee mug he offered, "about what happens next." Ethan tensed slightly, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "Next? My medical leave from the shelter ends next month. I'll be returning part-time at first, then hopefully full schedule by spring." She studied his expression carefully. "I've been wondering what your plans are." The question hung between them, gentle
but unavoidable. Ethan's nomadic lifestyle had been on indefinite hold since the forest rescue. His photography assignments declined or postponed while he focused on Sarah's recovery.
The borrowed time had extended far beyond what either had initially anticipated. "I don't know," he admitted, settling into the adjacent chair, where Max immediately positioned himself between them, head resting on Ethan's knee. "I haven't really thought about it." "That's not true," Sarah observed with the quiet perception that continually surprised him. "You've thought about it extensively. You just haven't decided." Ethan smiled faintly, acknowledging the accuracy of her assessment. "My lease on the storage unit where I keep my equipment renews next month. I should—" He paused, realizing he was falling into habitual patterns of distance and impermanence. "The truth is, I don't want to leave. But I'm not sure what staying looks like, practically speaking." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than pressuring. "For what it's worth, I don't want you to leave either." Nor does Max, obviously. The dog's ears perked up at his name, drawing a smile from both humans. "The guest room is yours for as long as you want it. Or," she hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness, "we could discuss more permanent arrangements if you're interested." The offer was clear in its implication, not just continued residence, but deeper integration into the household, into Sarah's life. The prospect was simultaneously appealing and terrifying, representing exactly the kind of commitment Ethan had carefully avoided since his military discharge. "I'm not good at staying," he admitted, voicing the fear that had driven years of deliberate transience. "After Afghanistan, after Ajax, I convinced myself it was safer to keep moving, for me, for anyone who might get close to me." "Safer emotionally, you mean," Sarah clarified, "not physically." "Yes." Ethan's hand absently stroked Max's head, finding comfort in the dog's solid presence. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the emotional numbness, they all made normal relationships seem impossible. My ex-wife said living with me was like living with a ghost. Sarah considered this, her expression compassionate but not pitying. "And now? Are you still a ghost?" The question struck at the heart of the transformation that had occurred since the forest rescue. Ethan realized with sudden clarity that his symptoms had significantly decreased during his time with Sarah and Max. Not vanished entirely, but diminished to manageable levels. The nightmares came less frequently. The hypervigilance had relaxed into normal, cautious awareness. The emotional numbness had given way to genuine connection. "No," he answered finally. "Not anymore. Or at least, less of one." "That's what healing looks like," Sarah said gently. "Not perfection. Just better than before, with continued improvement possible." She leaned forward slightly, wincing at the movement. "Ethan, I'm not asking for guarantees. At our ages, mine especially, life doesn't offer those anyway. I'm just suggesting we acknowledge what's already happened here, between the three of us, and consider building on it intentionally, rather than pretending it's temporary." The wisdom in her approach was undeniable. They had already formed a functional household, developed routines that accommodated each other's needs and quirks, created a shared life without formally acknowledging its permanence. The only thing missing was the commitment to continuity, the deliberate choice to build something lasting rather than provisional. "I'd like that," Ethan said finally, the admission both frightening and freeing. "To stay. To see where this goes." He glanced at Max, who watched the conversation with apparent understanding. All three of us.
The tension in Sarah's expression eased into quiet happiness.
Good. That's very good.
The conversation shifted to practical matters. Ethan's accumulated photography equipment that would need proper storage space, the workshop area he could use for developing prints, the adjustments to the home office that would allow shared use. The normality of these logistical discussions somehow made the significant emotional shift more manageable, translating abstract commitment into concrete actions. That evening, as autumn darkness settled around the house, Ethan stood on the back porch watching Sarah and Max in the garden below.
She moved slowly with her cane, inspecting late-blooming flowers, while Max patrolled the perimeter with his characteristic mixture of vigilance and joy. The scene embodied peaceful domesticity, the very thing Ethan had convinced himself he could never again experience after the chaos and loss of Afghanistan. His phone buzzed with a text message from his former commanding officer, the third attempt at contact that week. The message was brief but clear. The VA's new therapy dog program needs trainers with combat experience. Thought of you. No pressure, just an idea. Ethan stared at the screen, considering the possibility it represented. Since Ajax's death, he had deliberately avoided without working with service animals, the association too painful to contemplate. But now, with Max's influence and Sarah's gentle support, the prospect seemed less impossible, perhaps even healing in its own right. "Good news," Sarah called from the garden, noticing his absorption with the phone. "Maybe," he replied. "A job possibility, with service dogs for veterans." Sarah's expression brightened visibly. "That sounds perfect for you." "It's just an idea," he cautioned. "I haven't worked with dogs professionally since Ajax," she finished when he hesitated. "I know. But maybe that's exactly why you should consider it. Full circles have their own kind of beauty." The insight was characteristic of Sarah, direct yet compassionate, acknowledging pain while suggesting possibility beyond it. In the months since their forest encounter, Ethan had come to rely on this perspective, so different from his own tendency toward protective isolation. Max bounded up the porch steps, positioning himself between them as if physically connecting their separate spaces. The dog's integration into their relationship was seamless and essential. Not merely a pet they shared, but an active participant in their evolving bond. His intelligence, loyalty, and intuitive understanding of human emotion created a unique dynamic that neither had experienced in previous relationships. As darkness deepened around the property, the three figures formed a tableau of unexpected family, distinct individuals brought together by chance and trauma, now choosing continued connection despite the vulnerabilities it entailed. The forest rescue that had initiated their relationship seemed increasingly like fate rather than accident, as if some greater design had recognized complementary needs before they themselves understood them. Later that night, Ethan sat at Sarah's kitchen table reviewing the logistics of transferring his remaining possessions from various storage units to the house. The process would require multiple trips, careful organization, and permanent adjustments to living spaces that had previously belonged solely to Sarah. The practical aspects of commitment were surprisingly complex, a physical manifestation of the emotional integration already underway. Sarah joined him, tea in hand, studying the inventory list he had compiled. "That's quite a collection for someone who claimed to live minimally," she observed with gentle amusement. "Photographers accumulate equipment," Ethan explained, somewhat sheepishly. "Specialized lenses, lighting, developing supplies. It adds up over time." "We'll make room," she assured him. The basement has plenty of unused space.
And the north bedroom gets excellent natural light. It would make a good studio.
The casual use of we, rather than I, didn't escape Ethan's notice, a subtle linguistic acknowledgement of their shared future. He found himself increasingly comfortable with this shift from independence to interdependence, from isolation to connection. "There's something else," he said, reaching for the folder containing the VA program information his former commander had sent. "I'm considering this. Not immediately, but eventually. Part-time to start, see if it's a good fit." Sarah reviewed the materials with evident interest. Training service dogs for veterans with PTSD. Using your military and photography background together, she looked up, eyes bright with approval. It combines everything you're good at, Ethan, and it honors Ajax's memory rather than avoiding it. Her perception was unerring, identifying precisely the aspect that made the opportunity both appealing and intimidating. Working with service dogs would inevitably trigger memories of Ajax. But perhaps that connection could be healing rather than simply painful. A continuation of purpose rather than a reminder of loss. "I thought I might discuss it with Warner, actually," Ethan said, surprising himself with the realization. His community service involves working with a grief support foundation. They might be interested in partnering with the VA program, specifically for parents who've lost military children. Create something positive from our collective experiences. Sarah reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "That's incredibly thoughtful. Using your own trauma to help others navigate theirs." Her expression reflected something beyond approval, a deeper emotion that Ethan was still learning to recognize and accept. "You're a remarkable man, Ethan Miller. I'm very glad Max found you in that forest." The moment held a particular intimacy, not romantic in the conventional sense, but profoundly connected, acknowledging the unusual path that had brought them together and the choice they were making to continue that journey. At 65 and 38, they represented an unconventional household by typical standards, yet the configuration felt increasingly right for their specific needs and histories. Max, sensing the emotional significance of the exchange, approached to press his head against their joined hands, a canine blessing on the evolving bond. His extraordinary intuition continued to impress both humans, reinforcing Sarah's belief that some animals possessed wisdom beyond typical understanding. "We should celebrate," Sarah suggested, her pragmatic nature reasserting itself. "This weekend, invite a few people, my colleagues from the shelter, maybe your former commander, if he's local. Nothing elaborate, just an acknowledgement of new beginnings." The proposal would have triggered immediate resistance in the Ethan who had emerged from Afghanistan. Socialization had been among the first casualties of his PTSD, replaced by strategic isolation and emotional distance. But the months with Sarah and Max had gradually expanded his comfort with connection, rebuilding capacities he had believed permanently damaged by trauma. "I'd like that," he agreed, surprising himself with the sincerity of his response. "It's been a long time since I've had anything worth celebrating." Sarah's smile deepened the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of a life fully lived despite its sorrows. "Then it's definitely time." As they prepared for sleep that night, Sarah retiring to her bedroom, Ethan to the guest room that would soon be officially his, Max performed his usual security circuit of the house before settling in the hallway between their doors.
The dog's chosen sleeping position had evolved over time, shifting from Sarah's exclusive guardian to a more balanced protector of the household, recognizing Ethan as family rather than temporary caretaker.
In the quiet darkness, Ethan reflected on the extraordinary sequence of events that had led to this moment. A desperate dog appearing on a forest trail, a wounded woman in need of rescue, a grieving father seeking vengeance but finding redemption, a former soldier gradually reclaiming his capacity for connection. The narrative seemed almost designed in its progression from crisis to healing, from isolation to community. Sleep came more easily than it once had, no longer requiring the exhaustion of physical depletion to overcome hypervigilance. When Ethan dreamed, it was not of Afghanistan's horrors, but of Ajax running alongside Max across an open field, both dogs embodying the joy of purpose rather than the burden of protection. The image carried its own kind of healing, a subconscious integration of past and present, loss and renewal. Morning arrived. With gentle September sunlight filtering through curtains Sarah had helped him select for the guest room turned permanent bedroom. The subtle domesticity of shared decorating decisions represented one of many small acknowledgments that this arrangement was intended to last, to evolve from emergency response into chosen family. In the kitchen, Sarah was already awake despite the early hour, coffee brewing as she reviewed notes for her upcoming return to shelter volunteer work. Max sat attentively at her feet, anticipating the morning routine they had established during her recovery: medication with breakfast, gentle stretching exercises, a short walk to maintain mobility. "Sleep well?" she inquired as Ethan joined them, pushing a prepared coffee mug in his direction. "Better than usual," he confirmed, accepting the coffee with appreciation for both the beverage and the thoughtfulness behind it. "You're up early."
"Shelter meeting this afternoon. Just reviewing the intake procedures. They've apparently changed while I was away." She glanced up with a smile that transformed her features, erasing years of age through simple happiness. "Ready for our first official day as permanent housemates?" The question was light-hearted, but carried genuine weight, an acknowledgment that their arrangement had crossed a significant threshold from temporary accommodation to deliberate commitment. Not marriage or romance in the traditional sense, but a chosen family nonetheless, built on mutual respect, shared experience, and the extraordinary catalyst of a German shepherd who had recognized the potential for connection before they themselves understood it.
"Ready," Ethan confirmed, the single word carrying more certainty than he had felt about any decision since leaving the military. Max's tail thumped against the floor in apparent approval, his intelligent gaze moving between the two humans who had become his family through separate acts of rescue and recognition. In his canine perspective, uncomplicated by human anxieties about commitment and vulnerability, the arrangement simply confirmed what had already been evident. They belonged together. Three damaged souls, creating something whole through their complementary needs and capacities. As morning sunlight strengthened across the kitchen, illuminating the shared space that symbolized their unusual bond, Ethan recognized a sensation he had thought permanently lost in the aftermath of Afghanistan. Not merely contentment, but genuine hope for the future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities. Not perfect healing, as Sarah had wisely noted, but something potentially more valuable. The courage to remain open to connection despite knowing its inherent risks. "So," he said,
raising his coffee mug in a small gesture of celebration. "Here's to new beginnings." Sarah's smile deepened as she mirrored the gesture. "And unexpected families." Max barked once, as if adding his own affirmation to the moment, a final confirmation that some bonds, once formed, transcend conventional definitions and expectations. Three unlikely companions, brought together by trauma and circumstance, now choosing to build something lasting from those fragile beginnings. Outside, autumn wind scattered leaves across the property, nature's reminder that change, while sometimes painful, creates the necessary conditions for renewal. Inside, three survivors of different traumas shared quiet breakfast conversation, their distinct paths having converged into a common future none could have anticipated, but all now embraced with cautious but genuine hope. Spring arrived with deliberate gentleness, as if nature itself understood the need for gradual healing. The garden Sarah had neglected during her recovery now flourished under her renewed attention, perennials emerging from dormancy like promises kept. 6 months had passed since the courthouse hearing, since Ethan's decision to stay. A season of quiet integration and incremental growth for their unconventional household. Max lounged contentedly on the porch steps, watching Sarah tend to emerging tulips, while Ethan sorted through equipment in the converted workshop space. The dog's vigilance had softened with security, though he still maintained his self-appointed role as household protector, escorting Sarah on daily walks and accompanying Ethan to his new part-time position at the VA center. "The daffodils are particularly vibrant this year," Sarah called, gesturing toward a cluster of bright yellow blooms beneath the kitchen window. Nature's reminder that beauty follows dormancy. Ethan smiled at her characteristic philosophical observation. Sarah's perspective on renewal had gradually permeated his outlook, tempering the tactical hypervigilance of his military years with appreciation for cyclical healing. The recognition that damage needn't be permanent, that growth often followed necessary rest. "The Veterans Group is coming tomorrow to help with the garden expansion," he reminded her, setting aside the camera lens he'd been cleaning. "Franklin thinks the raised beds will be manageable even for those with mobility issues." The Veterans Gardening Program had been Ethan's initiative, an extension of the VA's therapy dog training that combined outdoor activity with canine companionship for former soldiers struggling with PTSD. Sarah had enthusiastically offered her property as a demonstration garden, her scientific background providing horticultural guidance, while Ethan's military experience created structured engagement for participants. "I've prepared the soil amendments they'll need," Sarah replied, straightening carefully with the deliberate movement that had become habitual since her injury. Though fully recovered according to her doctors, she maintained conscious awareness of her body's limitations, a wisdom Ethan had come to respect and gradually apply to his own healing process. Max suddenly raised his head, ears pivoting toward the driveway moments before the sound of approaching tires became audible to human ears. His posture remained relaxed, indicating a familiar visitor rather than a stranger. Sarah glanced questioningly at Ethan, who checked his watch with mild surprise. "Warner's early," he explained. "We scheduled review of the partnership proposal at noon." Daniel Warner's integration into their lives had progressed with careful boundaries and gradual trust. His court-mandated grief counseling had evolved into voluntary therapy that showed remarkable results. His community service hours dedicated primarily to the Foundation for Families who had lost children to medical negligence. The partnership proposal, connecting bereaved parents with veterans training service dogs, represented his most ambitious restorative effort, a bridge between different types of trauma and healing. Sarah nodded, brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "I'll make coffee." "The kitchen table has better light for reviewing documents anyway." This casual acknowledgement of Warner's presence in their lives would have seemed impossible months earlier, when his grief-fueled actions had nearly cost Sarah her life. The journey from that forest confrontation to today's collaborative meeting demonstrated the remarkable human capacity for transformation that underpinned Sarah's philosophy and increasingly influenced Ethan's worldview. Warner emerged from his car looking markedly different from the haunted man they had encountered in the forest. Regular therapy, purposeful community service, and the gradual unburdening of misdirected guilt had physically transformed him. His posture straighter, his movements more deliberate, his expression open rather than guarded. He carried a portfolio case and wore business casual attire that suggested professional purpose rather than merely fulfilling legal obligations. Max trotted down to greet him with the restrained friendliness he now displayed toward Warner, not the enthusiastic welcome reserved for household members, but a respectful acknowledgement that transcended his initial protective wariness. The dog's evolving response to Warner served as a visible barometer of their changing relationship. Trust, cautiously extended and gradually earned. "Hope I'm not too early," Warner called as he approached. "Traffic was lighter than expected."
"Perfect timing," Sarah replied from the porch, her tone polite but warm. "Coffee's just brewin', and Ethan was finishing up his equipment maintenance." The casual domesticity of this exchange, its normalcy, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought these three people together, struck Ethan as he observed it. In Afghanistan, he had witnessed temporary alliances between former enemies when shared purpose demanded cooperation. But those pragmatic arrangements dissolved once immediate objectives were achieved. This deeper reconciliation, with its foundation in genuine understanding rather than tactical necessity, represented something far more significant. In Sarah's kitchen, with its cheerful yellow curtains and abundant natural light, they reviewed the partnership proposal Warner had developed, with guidance from both the Grief Support Foundation and the VA program administrators. The concept was elegantly simple, yet potentially transformative. Parents who had lost military children would help train service dogs for veterans experiencing PTSD, creating mutual healing through shared purpose and companion animals. The Foundation's board unanimously approved the pilot program, Warner explained, spreading diagrams and budget projections across the table. 6 months initially, with 10 dog-parent veteran triads. The VA's contribution covers animal care and training equipment, while the Foundation funds transportation and facility usage. Ethan studied the materials with professional appreciation, noting the careful integration of therapeutic best practices with practical logistics. The training schedule looks manageable for participants with varying energy levels. That's important for both demographics. Sarah, who had been reviewing the participant selection criteria, looked up with evident approval. "You've incorporated trauma-informed screening for all parties. That's excellent forethought." Warner accepted these observations with quiet satisfaction, his expression reflecting professional pride rather than personal defensiveness. The screening was actually Aiden's idea, in a way. At their questioning looks, he elaborated. "In his journal, which I finally read last month, he wrote about wanting to establish better safety protocols for clinical trials, making sure participants understood risks beyond just signing forms.
It made me think about psychological safety in this program. The mention of his deceased son came without the raw grief that had previously accompanied any reference to Aiden. Therapy had not diminished Warner's love or memory, but had provided healthier channels for his pain, transformation rather than suppression, purpose rather than vengeance. As their discussion continued, Max maintained his position between Warner and Sarah, not aggressively protective as in their early encounters, but attentively present, occasionally shifting position to maintain contact with both humans. His extraordinary intuition regarding emotional states had become an accepted aspect of their interactions, his reactions serving as subtle guidance when conversations approached sensitive territory. "There's one element we haven't finalized," Warner noted, turning to a blank section in the proposal. "Location for the weekend retreats. The foundation is budgeted for facility rental, but finding appropriate spaces with both outdoor training areas and accommodation for 20-plus people and dogs has proven challenging." Ethan and Sarah exchanged glances, a wordless communication developed through months of shared living. Sarah nodded slightly, confirming their unspoken agreement before Ethan spoke. "We've been discussing that," he said carefully. "This property has 5 acres, most currently undeveloped. With some modifications, accessibility improvements, additional parking, it could serve as the retreat location, at least for the pilot program." Warner's surprise was evident. "That's extremely generous. But are you sure? Having groups of strangers here after everything?" "After everything is precisely the point," Sarah interjected gently. "This land has hosted my healing journey. Why shouldn't it serve others similarly?" She gestured toward the window overlooking her extensive property. "The gardens already have therapeutic value. The expansion project will create accessible planting areas. The woodland trail could accommodate training exercises. It makes practical and philosophical sense." The offer represented more than logistical convenience. It symbolized the complete transformation of their relationship with Warner, from victim and perpetrator to collaborative partners in broader healing. The property that had witnessed Sarah's physical recovery would now support others' emotional rehabilitation, completing a cycle of restoration that included all 3 principles in their forest encounter. Warner appeared momentarily overwhelmed by the gesture, his professional composure briefly yielding to genuine emotion. "I don't know what to say. Thank you seems inadequate. Say you'll help design the accessibility features," Ethan suggested pragmatically, recognizing Warner's discomfort with purely emotional exchanges. "Your engineering background would be valuable for the planning phase." This concrete request provided Warner with comfortable ground, allowing gratitude to express itself through contribution rather than merely words. He nodded, visibly relieved. "I'd be honored. In fact, I have some preliminary sketches for elevated gardening platforms I've been developing for the Foundation's Community Garden project. They might adapt well to this property's topography." As their meeting continued, shifting from proposal review to practical implementation planning, Sarah excused herself briefly to retrieve property surveys from her office. In her absence, Warner turned to Ethan with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "I need to ask something," he said quietly. "And please be completely honest. Are you both really comfortable with my regular presence here? Given our history, I would understand completely if this partnership utilized the property but limited my personal involvement." The question reflected Warner's ongoing commitment to respecting boundaries, an essential component of his rehabilitation and their evolving relationship. Ethan appreciated the directness of the inquiry, so different from the evasive interactions that characterized many post-trauma relationships. "Sarah and I have discussed this extensively," he responded with equal candor. "We're comfortable with your involvement because we've witnessed your genuine change. Max's acceptance of you confirms our assessment." He gestured toward the dog, who remained relaxed despite the conversation's intensity. "He's a better judge of character than either of us." Warner nodded, glancing at Max with something approaching reverence. "He found you in the forest. Saved her life through that choice." His voice lowered reflectively. "Sometimes I think about how many seemingly random factors had to align for that moment to occur. Your photography trip, his intelligence and determination, my delay in leaving the scene. Almost like purpose rather than coincidence," Ethan finished when Warner hesitated. "Sarah believes that. I'm still deciding." "And what do you believe?" Warner asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier uncertainty. Ethan considered the question seriously, appreciating its philosophical weight. "I believe in ripple effects, how one action influences countless others in ways we can't anticipate. My military service connected me to Ajax, whose death drove me to isolation, which positioned me in that forest at precisely the right moment. Your grief led you to confront Sarah, which precipitated the crisis that ultimately connected all of us." He shrugged slightly. "Whether that's random chance or something more deliberate, the outcome remains the same." This perspective, pragmatic yet open to meaning, reflected Ethan's evolving worldview, a blend of his military training's tactical focus and Sarah's more contemplative approach to life's patterns. Their complementary philosophies had created a balanced household perspective that increasingly informed his professional work with traumatized veterans. Sarah returned with the property documents, and their conversation shifted back to practical planning, measuring distances, identifying potential construction challenges, establishing project timelines. The ease of their collaborative discussion, with its natural flow between technical details and broader vision, demonstrated how far their relationship had evolved from adversarial beginning to purposeful alliance. As the meeting concluded and Warner prepared to leave, Sarah handed him a small paper bag. "Daffodil bulbs from the garden," she explained, "for fall planting. They're particularly resilient, capable of spreading even in difficult conditions." The gesture's symbolism wasn't lost on Warner, whose expression reflected recognition of both the literal gift and its metaphorical significance. "Thank you. I'll plant them at the Foundation's memorial garden." After his departure, Sarah and Ethan returned to their respective projects, she to the spring planting, he to equipment organization, while Max resumed his watchful position on the porch steps. The afternoon sunlight illuminated their separate activities within the shared property, a visual representation of their balanced interdependence. "Do you think the retreats will actually work?" Ethan asked later, as they prepared dinner, the domestic rhythm of chopping vegetables and measuring ingredients now comfortably familiar. Grieving parents and traumatized veterans aren't obvious therapeutic partners. Sarah considered the question while adjusting the stove temperature with practiced precision. "I think shared purpose transcends different types of trauma. Both groups understand profound loss, just through different mechanisms, working together towards something positive, especially with animals as intermediaries, creates connection that might not develop in traditional therapeutic settings. Her insight echoed Ethan's experiences at the VA center, where structured activities often facilitated emotional processing more effectively than direct conversation. The oblique approach to trauma, focusing on a shared task rather than the wounds themselves, had proven particularly effective with veterans resistant to conventional therapy. Like us, he observed, the parallel suddenly apparent. Different traumas, shared purpose. Sarah smiled, the expression warming her entire face. Exactly like us, though Max deserves primary credit for the connection. At the sound of his name, Max looked up from his position near the kitchen doorway, tail thumping against the hardwood floor in acknowledgement. His integration into their conversations remained one of the household's most distinctive features, his apparent comprehension transcending typical animal response. His presence a constant reminder of the intelligence that had initiated their unlikely family. That evening, as spring twilight settled across the property, they sat on the porch watching fireflies emerge among the garden shadows. Max lay contentedly between their chairs, occasionally sighing in canine satisfaction at the household's peaceful state. The scene embodied domestic tranquility, the very condition Ethan had believed permanently beyond his reach after Afghanistan's chaos and loss. The Veterans Group Coordinator called today, he mentioned, breaking the comfortable silence. Asked if we'd consider making the garden program a permanent arrangement, beyond the pilot phase. Apparently, they've received twice the expected applicant inquiries already. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. I've been considering something similar, expanding the property's therapeutic usage. The north field could accommodate additional raised beds, maybe a meditation garden. She glanced at him, gauging his reaction. It would mean more regular visitors, less privacy. The suggestion would have triggered immediate resistance in the Ethan who had emerged from military service, the hyper-vigilant soldier who required controlled environments and limited social interaction. But months of gradual healing had expanded his comfort with connection, rebuilding capacities he had believed permanently damaged by trauma. I think it's a good idea, he said, surprising himself with the ease of his agreement. The property has healing qualities that should be shared. And structure helps recovery, having regular commitments, seeing tangible results. Sarah reached across the space between their chairs, briefly squeezing his hand in silent acknowledgement of this significant shift in perspective. The gesture had become familiar between them, not romantic in the conventional sense, but deeply connected, reflecting their unique bond that transcended typical relationship categories. We could start with weekend programs, she suggested, practical planning following emotional agreement. See how that affects our daily rhythms before committing to anything more intensive. The collaborative nature of their decision-making had developed organically over months of shared living, each respecting the other's boundaries and needs while working toward common purpose. Unlike Ethan's previous relationships, including his failed marriage, this connection didn't demand conformity to predetermined roles, but instead celebrated complementary strengths. As darkness deepened around the property, a vehicle's headlights briefly illuminated the driveway before continuing past, a neighbor returning home rather than an approaching visitor. Ethan noted his reaction to the momentary intrusion, mild curiosity rather than tactical assessment, a normal response rather than hypervigilant surveillance. The shift represented significant progress in his recovery journey, trauma responses gradually yielding to healthier patterns. 1 year ago today," Sarah observed quietly. "I was in physical therapy, still using the walker, wondering if I'd ever garden again." She gestured toward her flourishing spring plantings, visible in the porch light's gentle illumination.
Now look at us. The simple statement encompassed extraordinary transformation. Not just Sarah's physical recovery, but their collective evolution from crisis to community, from trauma to purpose. What had begun with a desperate dog seeking help in a forest had developed into a healing sanctuary for 3 damaged souls, now expanding to serve others with similar wounds. "Look at us indeed," Ethan agreed, the phrase carrying weight beyond its casual delivery. Max shifted position, moving to press his head briefly against Sarah's knee, before returning to his watchful resting place. The gesture seemed deliberately comforting, as if the dog understood the emotional significance of their reflective conversation. "He still amazes me," Sarah commented, smiling at Max's intuitive response. "Sometimes I wonder what he actually comprehends about all this." "More than we realize," Ethan replied, watching the German Shepherd's alert posture. Ajax was the same way. Seemed to understand situations beyond what training could explain. Like they access something we can't quite grasp. The mention of Ajax came naturally now. Memories of his service dog integrated into conversation without triggering the acute grief that had previously accompanied any reference. Sarah's patient approach to emotional healing had helped Ethan develop this capacity, honoring loss without being incapacitated by it, allowing past and present to coexist rather than compete. As evening deepened into night, they moved indoors with the comfortable synchronicity developed through months of shared living. Max performed his customary security circuit of the property before settling in the living room, where Ethan reviewed training plans for the following day's VA session, while Sarah organized notes for her shelter volunteer shift. Their parallel activities in shared space embodied the balanced intimacy they had established. Independent pursuits within a collective environment, separate experiences united by common purpose. Not the conventional partnership that might have been expected, given their age difference and distinct backgrounds, but something uniquely suited to their particular needs and capacities. Later, preparing for sleep in their separate bedrooms, an arrangement that respected both privacy and their non-romantic connection, Ethan paused in the hallway where Max had stationed himself in his customary nighttime position. The dog's protective vigilance had evolved into a more relaxed guardianship, security established through presence rather than hypervigilance. "Good night, buddy," Ethan said softly, briefly kneeling to stroke Max's head. "Thanks for finding me in that forest." The simple acknowledgement of their extraordinary beginning felt appropriate on this anniversary of Sarah's recovery milestones. A recognition of the unlikely sequence that had transformed 3 isolated souls into family. Not through conventional bonds of blood or romance, but through the deliberate choice to remain connected, despite knowing vulnerability's inherent risks. As Ethan settled into sleep, his consciousness drifted toward memories not of Afghanistan's horrors, but of that forest encounter, Max's desperate intelligence, Sarah's quiet strength, even Warner's eventual redemption. The narrative had unfolded with almost deliberate progression, from crisis to healing, isolation to community, trauma to purpose. Morning arrived with gentle spring sunshine filtering through curtains now perfectly fitted to windows that framed Ethan's permanent bedroom. The subtle domesticity of personalized living space
represented one of many small acknowledgments that this arrangement had evolved beyond temporary accommodation into chosen family. In the kitchen, Sarah was already preparing breakfast despite the early hour, coffee brewing as she organized medications and reviewed the day's schedule. Max sat attentively nearby, anticipating the morning routine they had established: shared breakfast, coordination of daily activities, division of household responsibilities.
"Sleep well?" she inquired as Ethan joined them, pushing a prepared coffee mug in his direction with the thoughtfulness that characterized their relationship.
"Better than usual," he confirmed, accepting the coffee with appreciation. "Anniversary reflections, I suppose?" Sarah nodded, understanding, her expression warm with the quiet happiness that had gradually replaced grief's sharp edges. "A good year, despite its difficult beginning." The assessment was both accurate and profound, acknowledging pain while celebrating growth, respecting trauma's reality without allowing it to define their present. This balanced perspective had become the household's philosophical foundation, influencing their individual healing journeys and collective purpose. "The veterans arrive at 10, Ethan noted, consulting his phone calendar.
6 participants plus Franklin for the initial garden preparation. Should finish around noon, then lunch on the porch if weather holds." Sarah nodded approval. "I'll prepare the cold sandwiches before leaving for my shelter shift. The soup is already in the slow cooker. Should be perfect timing." This practical coordination, the seamless integration of separate responsibilities into cohesive household functioning, represented one of many small miracles comprising their daily existence. Neither had anticipated such comfortable interdependence when Max first brought them together, yet it had developed naturally from mutual respect and complementary needs. As morning light strengthened across the kitchen, illuminating 3 figures bound by circumstance and choice, Ethan recognized a sensation once thought permanently lost in Afghanistan's aftermath. Not merely contentment, but genuine optimism about the future, with all its uncertainties and possibilities. Not perfect healing, as Sarah had wisely observed, but something potentially more valuable: the courage to embrace connection despite knowing its inherent vulnerability. Outside, spring birds announced the day with cheerful persistence, nature's reminder that renewal follows dormancy with reliable certainty. Inside, 3 survivors of different traumas prepared for another day of purposeful activity, their distinct paths having converged into a common future none could have anticipated, but all now embraced with cautious but genuine hope. "So," Sarah said, raising her coffee mug in a small gesture reminiscent of their first official day as permanent housemates, "here's to unlikely beginnings and unexpected blessings." Ethan smiled, mirroring the gesture with deepening appreciation for this extraordinary woman who had helped restore his capacity for connection. "And to German shepherds with excellent judgment." Max barked once, as if acknowledging his essential role in their story, the catalyst whose desperate intelligence had recognized compatible broken pieces before they themselves understood their potential for collective healing. His tail thumped against the floor in apparent contentment, canine satisfaction with a mission successfully completed. Together they faced the morning, not as victim, rescuer, and service animal, their original configuration in the forest encounter, but as family created through deliberate choice rather than conventional obligation. Different wounds, shared healing. Separate histories, common purpose. 3 unlikely companions bound by the extraordinary recognition that sometimes the path through trauma leads not back to what was lost,
but forward to something never before imagined, but perfectly suited to who they had become. Sometimes life's most beautiful chapters begin in our darkest moments. When Sarah fell in that forest, she never imagined her German shepherd's desperate search for help would bring Ethan, a wounded veteran avoiding connection, into her life. Their journey from trauma to healing reminds us that it's never too late to build something meaningful, even after devastating loss. Like Sarah's daffodils that flourish after winter's dormancy, we too can find renewal when we least expect it. Their unconventional family, formed not through traditional bonds, but through deliberate choice, shows us that connection remains possible, even when we've convinced ourselves otherwise. Max's intuitive wisdom brought together three broken souls, creating something whole through their complementary needs. Their story whispers hope to those of us who've weathered loss, illness, or isolation. Healing doesn't mean returning to who we were before, but growing into something new and unexpectedly beautiful. What unexpected connections have brought healing to your life? Has an animal's love ever helped you through a difficult time? Share your story in the comments. We heal better when we heal together.